Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was driving back from my sister's place in Quincy, taking the long route through Deer Hollow Valley because the main highway was closed for overnight maintenance. It was close to 11 p.m., cold enough that the inside of my windshield kept fogging around the edges. The sky was clear though, one of those nights where the stars looked sharper than usual, like someone had turned up the contrast. Deer Hollow is basically a dip between two ridges, nothing but pines, narrow turns, and a straight stretch at the bottom where the road levels out. I've driven it dozens of times in daylight, but only a few times at night. It's usually peaceful in a way that feels empty, rather than relaxing. I had the radio off. My phone was plugged in, but not playing anything. Just me, the hum of the engine, and the sound of tires rolling over slightly uneven asphalt. I was on the straight stretch at the bottom of the valley when my headlights caught something overhead. It wasn't a branch or a bird or fog. It wasn't even close to the road surface. It was high, maybe 30-40 feet above me, and it moved across the beam for only half a second. A shape. Smooth. Shadowy. Not solid black, but darker than the sky. It glided across the top of the light like a manta ray would move through water. I instinctively hit the brakes, though not hard enough to skid. My seatbelt tugged against my chest as the car slowed. By the time I was rolling to a stop, the shape was gone. Or rather, it had already passed beyond the reach of the headlights. I leaned forward over the steering wheel, peering up through the windshield. The stars above were still visible, but something about them looked slightly dimmed in a trail across the sky, like a faint smudge or the afterimage of something passing. Not erased, not covered, just dulled. The road behind me was empty. Nothing but darkness stretching between the tree trunks. I couldn't hear anything either. No wind. No animals. Not even the tick of cooling metal from the car. I flicked on the high beams and scanned the trees on either side. Nothing moved. The pines stood completely still, their needles not even trembling. I cracked my window to listen better. The air outside was colder than I expected, with this heavy quality that made breathing feel slightly thicker. No sounds at all, not even distant ones. I waited. Another 5 seconds. 10. Nothing. I was about to roll the window back up when something shifted overhead. Not a sound, not a flash, just a sense like the darkness above me had wait for a moment. I leaned out farther, looking up through the gap between the car door and the roof. The sky looked normal, every star in place. But then, in a line above the ridge to my right, 3 stars dimmed slightly. Not blinked, dimmed. Faded to half brightness for maybe a second, then returned. A smooth transition, almost like someone had placed tinted glass in front of them and slid it away again. I got this cold flush down my arms that made my fingers tense around the steering wheel. I wasn't imagining it. Something had passed between me and those stars. Something big enough to affect several at once, but subtle enough not to blot them out. The heaviness in the air deepened, pressing faintly into my inner ears. Not painful, just an unmistakable shift, like stepping into an elevator right as it starts to move. Then the pressure eased. Not completely, but enough that I realized how quiet everything still was. I thought about turning the car around, but the road was narrow, and I wasn't thrilled about the idea of reversing down a curving stretch in the dark. So I crept forward, driving slowly now, my hands tight on the wheel. As I continued through the valley, I kept checking the sky. Every few seconds I glance up, expecting another shape to cross the beam or another patch of stars to dim. About a quarter mile later, just before the road curved back uphill, it happened again. This time, it wasn't overhead. It was off to my left, near the slope of the ridge. The stars in that area didn't dim all at once. They faded in a wave. A gentle, rolling darkening like something enormous and silent slid across the sky, not blocking the stars, but passing between them and me. The wave moved diagonally, slow and steady, then dissipated at the tree line. My car slowed on its own as I let my foot drift off the gas. I didn't see a shape this time, just the effect. A disturbance, almost. A presence without a form. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, shut off the engine, and sat there with my hands in my lap, breathing quietly. The moment the engine died, the silence felt deeper, like the absence of sound was more present than the sound itself had been. For a full minute, nothing happened. Then from somewhere far above the valley, a faint light pulsed once. It wasn't bright, more like a soft glow through distant fog, except the sky was crystal clear. A muted, colorless flash that lasted maybe half a second. It didn't illuminate the ground. It didn't cast shadows. It simply existed and then vanished. The air pressure shifted again, this time with a slight pop in my right ear. After that, the crickets returned. Not gradually. They came back in a sudden wave of sound, like someone had unmuted the night. A breeze whispered through the pines, and the world felt normal again in a way that made the previous silence even stranger. I turned the engine back on and drove the rest of the way to the valley without stopping. My hands didn't start shaking until I reached the first set of houses on the outskirts of town. When I got home, I stood in the driveway staring up at the sky for a long time. Everything looked normal. No dimming, no pulses, no motion, but the feeling of something massive passing overhead, something not shaped like anything I recognized, stayed with me. That smooth, shadowy glide caught in my headlights for that split second, too quick to fully see, but too real to dismiss. I still drive through Deer Hollow sometimes because it's the only route to my sister's place when the highway closes. But I don't take the straight stretch at the bottom without slowing down, and I never look directly up when I'm in the valley. Only at the road. Only at things I know how to explain. I heard the humming about halfway down Alder Street. It was late, close to midnight, and the weather had that warm, muggy feel Spokane gets in early September. I'd gone out for a walk because my apartment was too stuffy to sit in anymore, and I figured some air would help me sleep. There weren't many cars out, just the occasional one rolling through a stop sign like they didn't expect anyone else to be around. I was passing the empty lot next to the old Lau family house when the sound started. A low mechanical hum, steady and flat, almost like a generator running somewhere nearby. Except there were no houses close enough in that direction, and the lot had been empty for 2 years. I slowed down, thinking maybe someone was doing work in one of the garages behind the houses across the street. But the sound wasn't coming from either side. It was overhead. I stopped walking. The humming stopped at the same moment, like it had been synced to my footsteps. I waited a second, then started walking again. The hum came back. Same pitch, same volume, same everything. It hovered somewhere above me, not loud enough to hurt my ears, but loud enough to feel through my chest a little. I stopped again. Silence. I stood there staring up at the sky, even though I couldn't see much with the streetlights reflecting off the humidity. No stars, no moon, just a heavy gray sky. Nothing moved up there. I wasn't scared yet, just confused. I rubbed the back of my neck and turned around, planning to head back home, but the humming didn't come back when I walked this time. I figured maybe it had been a weird audio thing with my headphones, even though I wasn't wearing any. I kept walking, trying not to look over my shoulder too much. When I reached the intersection at Elm, the sound started again. This time it didn't wait for me to walk or stop. It just came on suddenly, louder than before. Still that low mechanical hum, but now it had a slight vibration to it, almost like there were two tones barely out of sync. I looked around for anything that could have been producing it. A helicopter, a drone, something. There was nothing in the air. The hair on my arms went up at once. Something about not seeing a source for the sound made it feel wrong. I crossed the street, picking up my pace without making it obvious to myself that I was doing it. The hum followed. Not above me exactly, but tracking me in a way that didn't feel random. I tried stopping one more time. Instant silence. I didn't move for a long minute. It was so quiet I could hear the faint buzz of the streetlight behind me. The humidity made the air feel thick in my throat. I took a breath, stepped forward. The hum returned immediately. I decided I wasn't going to keep testing it. I turned toward my apartment, which was about 9 blocks away, and walked as fast as I could without running. The sound matched my pace, always overhead, but never in a way I could pinpoint. When I passed the old Benton duplex, the porch light flicked on. It wasn't motion activated. I'd lived there once, and the switch for that light was inside near the kitchen. I sped up, keeping my eyes on the sidewalk. The hum pulsed once, just a tiny dip in the tone, like something had adjusted. I didn't look up. Half a block later, I felt a shift in the air. Not wind, more like pressure, the kind of feeling you get before a thunderstorm when everything feels charged. I told myself I was imagining it, but then the streetlight ahead of me flickered. Once, then again. Then it went completely dark. Only that one. All the others stayed on. I crossed to the opposite side of the street without even thinking about it. The hum moved with me. It didn't get louder or quieter. It just stayed centered above wherever I went. I tried calling someone just to have another human voice, but my phone didn't connect. It said no service, which made no sense because I'd had service walking down the exact same street earlier in the evening. I tried turning it off and on. The screen glitched, lines of static for half a second before rebooting normally. Still no service. The hum dipped again, just a slight shift. I broke into a fast walk, practically a jog. By the time I reached the block where the Peterson family lived, a place with 3 dogs that bark at everyone, the entire street was silent. No barking, no wind chimes, no insects, just the hum above me. When I looked toward the Peterson house, all 3 dogs were standing at the fence, completely quiet, staring upward. That's when my stomach dropped. They weren't looking at me. They weren't moving at all, just staring at something I couldn't see. I backed away slowly. The hum pulsed again, and the dogs turned their heads toward me in perfect unison. Not jerky or aggressive, just too synchronized to be normal. I left that block fast. My apartment was 3 blocks away now. I could practically see the building through gaps in the trees. I kept my head down and walked as quickly as I could without running. When I turned onto my street, the hum shifted for the first time. It didn't follow me directly. It drifted a few feet to the left, then corrected itself. Like something trying to match my position but struggling for a moment. I made myself walk normally until I got to the courtyard gate. The keypad light flickered when I entered the code. It clicked open on the second try. The second I stepped under the overhang of the building, the hum stopped completely. Not faded, not moved away, just cut off. The pressure in the air lifted. Sound came back. Distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere far off, the buzz of the courtyard light. I stayed there for a minute, listening for any sign it was still around. Nothing. When I finally walked up the stairs to my apartment, my phone buzzed suddenly. 5 notifications all at once. Missed calls, old texts, random app updates, like everything came through the moment the hum disappeared. Inside my place, everything looked normal. I locked the door and double-checked the windows. I sat on the couch trying to calm down, but the silence felt uneasy, heavy. About an hour later, I decided to take a shower, mostly to settle myself. When I stepped out of the bathroom, towel around my shoulders, I heard something faint through the window. A low hum. Not loud, not overhead. Somewhere farther away. Maybe a block or 2. I went still and listened. The hum shifted slightly, like it was searching for something. Then it faded into the distance. I didn't leave my apartment again until morning. When I walked the same route the next day, everything looked normal. The streetlight wasn't broken. The dogs barked like usual. My phone worked fine. Nothing explained it. Nothing even came close. But every now and then, when the neighborhood gets quiet late at night, I think I hear that same low mechanical hum somewhere in the distance, like it's moving down another street, following someone else's footsteps. I noticed the weather alert first. It was 2:43 a.m. and my phone screen was glowing on the nightstand like I'd already picked it up and forgotten to put it back. The alert banner said, "Atmospheric disturbance in your area," which I'd never seen before. Not a storm warning, not high winds, just that phrase. I didn't remember waking up. I sat up slowly, trying to figure out why I was awake at all. My room in Laramie was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy. No wind against the window, no distant trucks on the highway, nothing. I could see the faint orange streetlight bleeding in around the blinds. When I checked my phone, the first thing I noticed was the step count. 78 steps between 2:17 and 2:41. I stared at that number longer than I probably should have. My apartment was small, a living room, a kitchenette, and a bedroom. 78 steps meant I'd been walking around, not just standing or shifting in bed. walking. But I had no memory of getting up. I walked into the living room to see if anything looked disturbed. The air felt cooler than usual, even with the heater set to kick on overnight. The carpet had that slightly cold, almost damp feeling, though I didn't see any condensation on the windows. I touched the lock on the front door. It was engaged, but halfway between fully vertical and horizontal. Not unlocked, just not how I left it. I'm one of those people who checks the door twice before bed. I knew I'd turned it all the way. The deadbolt was still set, at least. I checked the kitchen, running through the usual worries. Did I leave the stove on? Did I forget to close the window? But everything was fine. My shoes were by the door. My jacket hung on the hook where I always left it. The weird part was that my keys were on the floor. Not far, just next to the entry rug, but I never leave them there. I always drop them in the ceramic bowl on the counter. Seeing them on the ground gave me a strange sinking feeling, like I'd been in a hurry earlier, even though I hadn't left the apartment all day. I went back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed. My phone buzzed again. Another alert. Atmospheric disturbance detected. Remain indoors. I opened the full notification, assuming it was from NOAA or the usual weather app, but it didn't say the source. Just a generic icon and text that didn't link anywhere. The timestamp flickered for half a second while I was reading it, like the screen glitched. I backed out and checked the step counter again. Now it said 83 steps. That made no sense because I hadn't walked anywhere since checking. I tried refreshing it. The number didn't change. Then the apartment lights flickered. Just once, really quick, but long enough that the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and pull back. The hum of the refrigerator went quiet for a second before starting up again. The heater clicked off even though it wasn't supposed to. The silence after that felt sharper. I looked toward the window. The blinds moved slightly, like someone had brushed a hand across them from the outside. Just one narrow sway. I stood up but didn't go near it. My phone buzzed again, but when I checked it, there were no new notifications. Nothing at all. Even the weather alert had vanished from the history. Only the time showed 2:47 a.m. I opened the front-facing camera. I don't know why. Maybe to see if there was anything behind me. The image looked normal for a second before the exposure dropped sharply, like the room was darker than it really was. The background behind me warped slightly, the edges bending inward, as if the camera was struggling to process depth. Then it froze, just for a moment. The screen locked on an image of me with this distorted background shrinking toward a point behind my shoulder. I closed the app. When I walked back toward the living room, my socks picked up something cold on the carpet. I crouched down and touched it. The fibers were wet. A small patch, maybe the size of my palm, like someone had tracked in snow and it had melted. But the moisture wasn't near the door. It was near the center of the apartment, Memphis, nowhere close to anything that could have leaked. I checked the ceiling. Dry. No dripping. The heater clicked on again suddenly, blowing warm air across the room. It startled me enough that I stepped back, bumping into the coffee table. My phone vibrated again. This time it was the step counter. 106 steps since midnight. Before I could react, the apartment filled with a faint sound. A soft, low vibration. Not exactly a hum, more like the air had taken on a tone. You know how sometimes you can hear when a truck is idling outside, but you can't pinpoint the direction? It felt like that. All around me. Diffused. I looked at the window again. The blinds were completely still now, but I got a weird feeling that something was close to the exterior wall. Not touching it, just near it. My phone screen dimmed on its own, then brightened, then dimmed again. The battery percentage jumped from 68% to 54% in a second. The temperature reading said the device was cooling down, even though it was warm in my hand. Another weather alert popped up. Atmospheric disturbance. Severe. The word severe looked wrong. The font was slightly different, like it didn't match the rest of the system notifications. I tapped it, but nothing opened. The banner just shook once and faded away. I backed toward the bedroom, thinking maybe I was overtired or getting sick or something that made everything seem distorted and unfamiliar. But before I reached the doorway, the light in the hallway flickered again, this time in a pattern. Short, long, long, short. Almost like it was attempting something, or responding. The refrigerator hum cut out entirely. The The whole apartment fell silent in a way I'd never heard before, not even the faint buzz of electronics. I held my breath. There was a soft tapping sound outside the living room window. Rhythmic. 3 taps. A pause. 2 taps. Another pause. Then 1 tap. Not like someone knocking, more like something lightly brushing or flicking the glass. I backed into the bedroom and closed the door partway. The tapping stopped, the low vibration in the air lessened, fading out bit by bit until it was gone. When everything went silent again, I checked the time. 3:11 a.m. I realized I didn't remember anything between 2:47 and then. No sense of time passing, no awareness of standing still. It felt like a jump cut in my memory. My step counter updated again, 143 steps between 2:50 and 3:09. I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to slow my breathing. The apartment felt normal again. Heater running, fridge humming, faint traffic noise outside. Nothing out of place, except the damp spot on the carpet had dried completely. Not even a shadow left behind. I stayed awake until the sky started turning pale around 6. I walked around the apartment checking everything. Locks, windows, vents. Nothing was disturbed. The weather alert history was empty again. My phone battery was back at 62% without being plugged in. The step counter still showed the movement, though. Every time I looked at that graph, a cold feeling settled into my stomach. The steps formed a looping pattern, back and forth, like pacing. More steps than the apartment had room for, unless I was walking in tight circles. I didn't remember any of it. When I left for work later that morning, the air outside felt normal. Clear. No wind. No strange pressure. But when I checked the weather app again around lunchtime, buried in the list of old notifications was one last alert I hadn't seen before. It was timestamped 2:44 a.m. Atmospheric disturbance has passed, normal conditions resumed. It didn't match any official alert format, and somehow my phone had saved only that one. I was lying in bed on a Tuesday night just staring at the ceiling because I couldn't sleep when I noticed a faint white glow sliding across it. At first, I thought it was headlights from a car turning around outside. My apartment faced a narrow residential street in Tacoma, and sometimes people used it to flip a U-turn. But this light wasn't sweeping in from the window at an angle. It was already there, like a smudge of pale light drifting slowly from one corner of the ceiling to the other. It moved steadily, not flickering, not bouncing, just gliding. I pushed myself up on my elbows to get a better look. The second I sat up, it disappeared. Not faded, not moved out of sight, just gone. My room felt colder right away. That was the first thing I noticed. The heater had been on earlier because it had been raining all evening and the air felt damp, but suddenly it felt like someone had cracked a window open. The back of my neck prickled. I sat there for a few seconds, waiting for car lights to pass across the wall. Nothing did. The street outside was quiet. I could hear rain tapping lightly against the gutters. I told myself it had to be headlights at a weird angle, maybe refracting off something wet. I lay back down. Maybe 30 seconds later, it came back. Same faint white glow. Not bright enough to light the room. Just bright enough that I could see it clearly against the dark paint. It moved slowly, like someone dragging a flashlight across the ceiling from above the roof. But I lived on the top floor. I held my breath and watched it move. It wasn't perfectly circular, more like an oval, soft around the edges. It slid across the ceiling, paused for just a second near the center, then continued. I didn't move this time. It stopped directly above me. I could feel my heart beating harder, but I kept still. The glow didn't flicker. It just hovered there, centered over the bed. Then it dimmed slightly, almost like it was pulling back. I sat up again, quick this time. Gone. The cold feeling rushed back immediately, stronger than before. The air felt wrong, like the pressure had shifted. I swung my legs off the bed and stood up. The carpet felt colder too. That part stuck with me, like the whole room had dropped a few degrees in seconds. I walked to the window and pulled the curtain aside. The street was empty. No cars idling, no headlights turning corners, just wet pavement reflecting the orange street lamp at the end of the block. I checked the time on my phone, 12:17 a.m. I stayed by the window for a minute, watching for anything that might explain it. Nothing did. When I turned back toward the bed, the glow was there again. Only this time it wasn't on the ceiling. It was on the wall above my dresser about 4 feet off the ground. It moved slowly to the right. I froze. My brain kept trying to make it something normal. A reflection. A drone. Someone outside with a flashlight. But it was too steady. Too controlled. It slid across the wall and stopped near the closet door. The closet door was closed. The glow sat there for a few seconds. Then it moved down. Not fast, just steady. From the wall to the top of the closet door, then down the door itself. I felt this wave of dread, like something was measuring the room. I stepped toward it. The second I did, it blinked out again. The cold air hit me harder this time. I actually saw my breath for a split second, which made no sense because it wasn't that cold in the apartment. I reached over and flipped on the bedroom light. Everything looked normal. My dresser, the closet, my bed, nothing out of place. I stood there listening. That's when I heard it. A low humming sound, not loud, almost below hearing, like when a refrigerator is running in another room. But it wasn't coming from inside the apartment. It felt like it was coming from above the ceiling. I live in a 3-story building, no attic space above my unit, just the roof. The hum wasn't mechanical exactly, it didn't have a clear rhythm, it just vibrated. I checked my phone again, 12:17 a.m. Same time. I stared at the screen, confused. I was sure at least 5 or 10 minutes had passed since I first saw the light. I even opened my messages to see if anything had updated. The last text I'd sent was at 11:58. I walked into the living room and checked the stove clock. 12:43 a.m. I went back to my bedroom. My phone still said 12:17. That made my stomach drop in a way I can't really explain. I turned the phone off and back on. When it restarted, it showed 12:44. The humming stopped right then, not faded, just cut off. I stood there in the doorway for a long time. The apartment felt normal again. Not cold, not heavy. I didn't sleep that night. I left all the lights on and sat on the couch watching some random show with the volume low, just to have noise. Around 3 a.m., I heard something outside on the balcony. A soft scraping sound. My balcony overlooked a small patch of grass and a parking lot. No easy way to climb up there unless someone dragged a ladder. The scraping came again. Slow, like something shifting its weight. I forced myself to step toward the sliding glass door and part the blinds just enough to look out. The rain had stopped. Everything was wet and reflecting the dim security light near the parking lot. There was nothing on the balcony, but the security light flickered once, then dimmed, then came back on. I stayed there watching, expecting to see someone run across the lot or a car start up. Nothing moved. When I finally lay down on the couch around 4 a.m., I must have fallen asleep for a little while. I woke up disoriented. Sunlight was coming through the blinds. My neck hurt like I'd slept wrong. I checked the time. 10:32 a.m. I sat up quickly. My bedroom light was off. I was sure I'd left it on. I walked back into the bedroom slowly. The bed was made, not perfectly, but the blanket was pulled up and the pillows were arranged. I hadn't touched it since getting out of it around midnight. For a second, I wondered if I'd done it without thinking. But I don't make my bed. Ever. Especially not in the middle of the night. The room felt normal. Warm, even. I stepped inside and looked at the ceiling. Nothing. I checked my phone's battery usage, trying to piece together the timeline. It showed a gap between 12:18 a.m. and 3:02 a.m., where there was almost no activity at all. No background refresh, no notifications coming through, which didn't make sense because I'd been using it on the couch. I walked out onto the balcony in daylight. There were faint scuff marks near the railing. Not deep scratches. Just light streaks in the moisture, like something smooth had pressed there. Could have been from before. Could have been anything. I leaned over the railing and looked up at the roof. There were no footprints, no damage, nothing unusual. The rest of the day felt off. My apartment felt bigger somehow, quieter, like sound was being absorbed. That night, I didn't turn the lights off at all. I lay in bed again, staring at the ceiling. Nothing happened. No glow, no hum, just the normal city sounds drifting through the window. But around 1 a.m., my bedroom got cold again. Not freezing, just noticeably colder. I held my breath and watched the ceiling. No light this time. Instead, I heard 3 soft taps above me. Not random creaks. 3 evenly spaced taps, like someone knocking lightly from the other side. I didn't move. The taps didn't come again. I stayed awake until morning. Nothing else happened after that. No more lights. No humming. But sometimes late at night, when the apartment is quiet and the street is empty, I still find myself staring at the ceiling, waiting for that faint white glow to slide across it again. It hasn't, at least not while I've been looking. I was stretched out on the hood of my car just outside Los Alamos, trying to kill time after a long day. The sky was clear enough that the Milky Way looked like someone had brushed a pale stripe across the dark. It was one of those dry, crisp nights where every sound carries, even the small ones. I could hear the faint hum of the lab's distant generators, the occasional truck on the highway, and nothing else. I wasn't looking for anything weird. I just didn't feel like going home yet. I'd been staring at the same patch of sky for maybe 5 minutes when something shifted. At first, I thought my eyes were just adjusting because the stars in that area suddenly looked out of focus. Not dimmer, just blurred, like a thumbprint smeared across a lens. I blinked a few times, thinking maybe I'd zoned out, but the distortion stayed. It was about the size of my palm, held out at arm's length, just a soft smudge where the stars lost their sharpness. The edges weren't clean. They rippled a little, like heat coming off asphalt, except I wasn't looking at the ground. I was looking straight up at a cold sky. I slid off the hood and stood, craning my neck. The smudged patch drifted a few degrees to the left. Not fast, just steady, like a slow-moving cloud. Except there were no clouds. The rest of the sky was perfect. Every star sharp, every constellation exactly where it should be. The blurred patch moved sideways for maybe 10 seconds. Then it vanished all at once. One moment it was there, rippling faintly against the stars, and the next it was gone, leaving the sky completely normal. No fade out, no transition, just gone. I stood there trying to convince myself it was some kind of weird eye strain. The desert air was dry, maybe my contacts were acting up. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. Everything looked fine. I climbed back onto the hood, but I wasn't as relaxed now. I kept scanning the sky, waiting for the blur to come back. It didn't, but something else did. About a minute after the distortion disappeared, I felt a slight vibration through the hood of the car. A faint tremor, almost like when a heavy truck drives past, but the road was too far away for that. The metal under me hummed just barely. Not loud, not strong, just enough that I noticed it. Then the radio inside the car clicked on by itself. Volume low, no station, just static. I hadn't touched the keys. I climbed off the hood again, opened the driver door, and shut the radio off manually. The moment I touched the dial, the static popped in my ears like someone unplugged a speaker. It startled me enough that I jerked my hand back. The vibration in the hood stopped at the same time. The desert around me felt suddenly too quiet. Even the faint hum from the distant buildings seemed muted. I looked back up at the sky. 3 stars near Orion flickered in a strange sequence, one, then another, then the third. Not twinkling, but blinking, like someone was dimming them deliberately. I checked to see if maybe a thin cloud had drifted through, but the rest of the stars around them stayed steady and bright. Only those 3 changed. I tried checking a star map app on my phone to reassure myself I wasn't misidentifying something, but the app wouldn't load. Not frozen, just stuck on its loading screen. My signal was fine, but the compass reading kept spinning, like the phone couldn't figure out which way was north. I lowered the phone. The same patch of sky blurred again. Not exactly in the same spot, slightly lower this time, but definitely the same distortion. The stars behind it warped, bending inward as if the space itself was shifting. I stepped backward instinctively until I bumped into the car. The blur pulsed once, almost like it tightened or contracted. Then it drifted diagonally across the sky, faster than before, maybe crossing 20 or 30 degrees of sky in a few seconds. I actually felt the air pressure change when it passed overhead, just a faint tightening in my ears, like when an elevator starts moving. Then, again, it disappeared instantly. No gradual clearing, no fading, just nothing. I kept staring at the place where it had vanished, waiting for something else to happen. My breathing felt loud in my chest. I realized my hands were shaking a little, even though the night wasn't that cold. I turned in a slow circle to see if anything in the landscape looked unusual. The juniper bushes, the low rocks, the small dips in the dirt, everything looked exactly as it had when I arrived. But then I noticed something strange near my tires. The ground around my car looked patterned. Not footprints, not tire tracks, more like the surface had been pressed with something wide and flat, leaving shallow indentations almost like overlapping arcs. 3 or 4 of them, barely visible unless I angled my phone's flashlight just right. They weren't there before. I would have noticed. I crouched down to touch one of the indentations. The dirt was cold. Not normal desert night cold, but refrigerator cold. The temperature difference made me pull my hand back. I hovered my palm over the spot again, and I could feel the chill radiating outward. I stood up quickly and checked the sky one more time. Everything looked normal again. The distorted patch didn't return. The 3 flickering stars stayed steady. The pressure in the air eased back to normal, and even the faint hum of the distant facilities came back like nothing had happened. I got in my car and turned the key. The engine started right away, but the dashboard clock reset to 12 a.m., blinking like I disconnected the battery. I hadn't touched anything under the hood. When I pulled out onto the dirt road, my headlights flickered once, just once, and then stayed solid. I chalked it up to nerves, but it didn't feel like a coincidence. As I drove, I kept checking the sky in the rearview mirror. Every time I blinked, I expected to see that blur drift back into view. It never did. But the weirdest part came when I got home and checked the time. The drive from that spot to my apartment takes about 15 minutes. My dashboard clock was blinking 12, but my phone said 1:27 a.m. I'd only been out there for about an hour. I checked my call logs, my email timestamps, anything I could think of to confirm the time. They all matched the phone. Nothing was missing. I didn't feel like any time had skipped. I didn't feel dizzy or sick. The only thing off was the car. The hood was faintly warm on the left side, colder on the right, as if the temperature had been manipulated unevenly. One of the overlapping patterns in the dust showed up on the fender under the porch light, just barely visible, like it had pressed against the metal the same way it pressed into the dirt. I touched it. The metal felt normal, but I knew it hadn't been there when I left. I stayed outside for a few more minutes, watching the sky. The stars were sharp, unmoving, ordinary. I went inside, locked the door, and sat on the couch without turning any lights on. At some point, without thinking, I opened the star map app again. It loaded instantly. The compass pointed north. Every constellation matched perfectly. Except for one thing. The section of sky where I'd first seen the distortion was tagged with a strange marker, something I hadn't added. A tiny gray circle with no label, no description, no link. When I tapped it, the app froze for a moment. Then the marker disappeared. I was camping alone near Kettle River, a few miles outside Curlew on a stretch of forested land my friend Jordan swore was perfect for a quiet weekend. It was late September and already cold enough that the air stung a little when I inhaled. I'd built a small fire, eaten a canned stew that tasted like metal, and crawled into my tent around 10. I wasn't asleep when the light appeared. I was lying on my back, listening to the distant rush of the river and the occasional crack of branches settling in the cold. I remember thinking the night felt unusually still. No wind, no owls. Even the insects were weirdly quiet. Then a soft light appeared behind the trees to the east of my tent. Not bright. Not the kind that floods everything at once. More like a warm, steady glow that slowly grew stronger until it cast long shadows across the forest floor. My tent lit up on one side like somebody was holding a lantern just outside, but it wasn't flickering. It was too uniform for that. I sat up fast, thinking maybe another camper had shown up late or someone was walking through the woods. When I unzipped the tent flap and stepped out, the light was still there. It didn't move, didn't sway. It just hovered somewhere behind a cluster of tall pines, far enough away that I couldn't see a source, but close enough that the brightness felt unnatural. Every tree cast a shadow stretching toward me. Thin, stretched-out shapes that looked wrong at that angle. The light stayed completely steady, 5, maybe 6 seconds. Then it blinked out instantly, not faded, vanished like someone flipped a switch. The darkness afterward felt twice as heavy. My eyes struggled to adjust. For a moment, I could only see the faint orange glow of my fire near the rock ring. I didn't hear any footsteps, no engine, no voices. Just nothing. I waited a long minute before moving, half expecting the light to come back. When it didn't, I walked to the edge of the firelight and stared into the trees. Everything looked normal. Tall trunks, thick undergrowth, patches of moonlight where the canopy broke apart. I told myself it had to be a hunter or a stray ATV or something. But no ATV light looked like that. Too soft, too warm, too controlled. And the shadows it cast had been too sharp and too long for anything that low to the ground. My hands were shaking a little, and the cold wasn't helping. I added another log to the fire and sat back down, telling myself I'd imagined the steadiness, that human eyes play tricks in the dark. About half an hour passed with nothing unusual. The fire crackled normally. The night stayed silent. Then something changed. The air felt different. Not colder, but denser, like the atmosphere shifted slightly. I felt it in my sinuses, that same pressure drop I get before a heavy storm. I heard a pop from the cooling metal of my camp stove. I turned toward the trees again. No light this time, but the shadows cast by the moon seemed off. Usually they're diffuse, kind of blurry around the edges. But these were sharp, almost outlined, like the moonlight had gotten brighter without actually brightening. I got up and clicked on my flashlight. The beam looked normal, which somehow made the strange shadows worse. They didn't behave like they were responding to my light at all. I backed up slowly. The river sounded farther away now, like the sound was muffled. The whole forest felt muted, like it wasn't really listening. A branch snapped. Not loud, not dramatic, just a single, crisp snap coming from the same direction the strange light had been. My flashlight beam trembled in my hand. I aimed it toward the trees, but the undergrowth swallowed the light instantly. It didn't reach as far as it should have. I stepped closer, pulling the beam along the trunks, trying to spot any movement. Nothing. I thought about calling Jordan, but I didn't want to look down at my phone and lose track of whatever might be in the trees. I didn't want anything to get closer without me hearing it. I turned toward the fire. That's when I noticed the smoke was rising in a straight column, perfectly vertical. No wind at all, not even the faint drift that usually comes off a campfire. The hairs on my arms stood up. I walked back to the fire and crouched beside it. The smoke continued straight up into the night sky, until it reached maybe 6 or 7 feet above me. Then it bent to the right, like it had hit something invisible. I actually stepped back from it. The smoke kept pressing along that angle, as if guided by a current I felt nowhere else. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The sudden vibration made me jump. I fumbled it out and saw a notification flash on the lock screen before disappearing. Couldn't read it. Too fast. The screen brightness flickered once, dimmed, brightened, dimmed again. I tried unlocking it, but the screen froze for a second with faint horizontal lines across it like interference. When it finally responded, the battery had dropped from 78% to 41%. I wasn't using it. It had been on standby. I turned it off out of reflex and pocketed it again. Behind me, another branch snapped, then another. Not in the same place this time. These were quieter, like twigs under light footsteps. I didn't hear breathing or movement, just tiny snaps spaced a few seconds apart. I pointed my flashlight back at the tree line. Something reflected the beam. Not eyes, too far apart, too dull. More like the beam bounced off two smooth surfaces for an instant before vanishing. I lowered the flashlight and raised it again, trying to catch the reflection a second time. Nothing. My mouth felt dry. I decided I'd sleep in my truck instead of the tent. The idea of zipping myself into a thin piece of fabric suddenly seemed impossible. I kept the flashlight up while I backed toward the campsite. My truck was parked just 20 feet away down a small slope. I grabbed my keys off the camp table, but the metal felt colder than it should have, like it had been sitting in a freezer instead of the night air. When I clicked the unlock button, the truck's lights flickered on, but only halfway. The headlights glowed a dull, weak yellow before snapping back to full brightness. I opened the driver door and tossed my sleeping bag inside. Then the soft light appeared again, behind the same trees, same glow, same steady brightness. It cast those long, stretched shadows again, reaching across the forest floor like fingers. I stood completely still. The light didn't move. It didn't brighten or dim. It just hovered there, illuminating the same trunks, the same patch of undergrowth, the same unnatural sharpness in the shadows. 1, 2, 3, 4 seconds, 5. Then it blinked out instantly. Again. The darkness after felt worse than before. My flashlight looked weak compared to whatever that glow had been. I climbed into the truck and shut the door. The cab didn't feel warm or safe, but at least the locks made a solid click. I turned the key halfway to start the engine, but the radio lit up first on its own, set to static. Just a low hiss with an occasional bump of sound like someone brushing the microphone. I turned it off, but the static stayed faintly audible for another second before fading. I started the engine. The headlights flickered once more, then held steady. I backed up, keeping my eyes on the tree line, half expecting the light to appear again. It didn't, not while I was watching. Instead, something else happened. As I turned onto the dirt road leading out of the clearing, my rearview mirror dimmed automatically, like it does for bright headlights behind you. But there were none. The mirror just darkened itself for no reason. I looked back anyway. Total darkness. I drove slowly down the road, every bump making my nerves spike. When I reached the fork that led back toward Curlew, the radio hissed again for a brief moment, even though it was still off. The volume knob twitched by itself, turning a fraction of an inch before stopping. I didn't touch it. The trees thinned as I got closer to town. The sky opened up, and I felt the atmosphere ease a little, like something had stayed behind in the woods. When I finally pulled into my driveway at home, the exhaustion hit me all at once. I sat there for a minute with the engine off, listening to the normal sounds: crickets, a dog barking a few houses over, cars passing in the distance. Everything felt normal again. But when I grabbed my phone out of my pocket to check the time, the lock screen background had changed. A blank black image. Not one I'd ever saved. And in the upper right corner next to the time, a faint white glow flickered for half a second before disappearing. Soft, steady, then gone. I was fishing off a narrow dock on Lake Manona, the kind near the bike path where the shore lights don't reach the water. It was early August, humid enough that my shirt stuck to my back, and the sky was hazy from wildfire smoke drifting in from somewhere out west. I'd gone out late, around 11:30, because the day had been loud and crowded, and I just wanted a quiet place to sit. The lake was almost completely calm. No breeze, no waves, barely even the small ripples from the bluegill moving under the surface. I had a small lantern clipped to my tackle box, but it didn't throw much light. Mostly I was sitting in the dark with my line hanging straight down and the occasional mosquito whining past my ear. Nothing strange happened at first. I caught one small bass and let it go. I listened to some distant music coming from one of the houses across the water. A car door slammed somewhere far off. A couple minutes passed where everything was totally silent. Then the water changed. It didn't glow or boil or anything dramatic. It just smoothed out. The ripples flattened like something heavy pressed them down. The whole surface took on this faintly reflective quality, like black glass. I could see the blurred shape of the trees behind me, the lantern's glow, even the angle of the dock posts, almost like I was standing over a mirror instead of a lake. I leaned forward, thinking the wind had died completely, and that was all it was. But my reflection didn't look right. The lantern light was steady, dim, and warm. But on the lake's surface, it had a second reflection that floated a little to the left of where the real lantern sat. This second reflection wasn't warm. It was this faint bluish-white shimmer, and it moved slightly, drifting across the water's surface even though nothing above the water was moving. I frowned and turned the lantern off just to see what would happen. The real reflection disappeared. The dim blue one didn't. It stayed on the water, moving slowly, like something drifting in the reflection of a boat light. The weirdest part was that when I looked up at the spot where the light should have been, there was nothing. Just hazy night sky and faint shoreline shadows. I stepped closer to the edge of the dock. The reflection slid sideways. Not fast, just a gentle drift, like someone pulling a flashlight beam through fog. It traced along the smooth surface of the lake, leaving a faint trail of brightness behind it before that faded too. I tried to convince myself there was a boat out there with a weird LED light, but I didn't hear anything, not even the soft slap of water against a hull. The lake was too quiet for anything to be moving around unnoticed. My fishing line tugged suddenly. Not a bite, more like something brushed against it. The bobber didn't move at all. It just rested on top of that strange, glossy water, almost unnaturally still. Then the reflection brightened. Barely, but enough that I took a step back. It stretched as though the light source had elongated. The shape wasn't circular anymore. It was more like a faint oval with a blurred edge. The pull on my fishing line tightened, and I reeled in slowly, expecting to feel weeds or a large fish. The line came up clean. I looked back at the water. Now there were two faint reflections. Not identical, one slightly brighter, drifting at a different angle. They moved in slow, smooth arcs, like two dim shapes passing each other in a mirrored world. Above the lake, nothing. I checked behind me, thinking maybe a bike or jogger's headlamp was causing it, but the path was empty. The houses across the lake were dark except for a porch light or two. No boats, no drones, no aircraft. The reflections moved closer to the dock. I crouched down to get a better look. Up close, the water didn't just look reflective. It looked thick, almost like oil. I could see my face in it, fainter than normal, elongated slightly, as if the angle of the reflection wasn't quite correct. My own eyes looked offset by a fraction of an inch. The brighter of the two dim lights drifted right over the place where my reflection's head was. On the water's surface, in the reflection, it looked like a small glowing object passing above me, but I felt nothing. No warmth, no breeze, no sound. Above the lake there was still only darkness. The second reflection drifted farther out, then stopped completely. So did the first. Both glowed faintly in place. The cold feeling hit me then, not a temperature drop exactly, but the sensation that the air wasn't moving around me, like the lake was holding its breath. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I jumped, nearly slipping on the dock, and pulled it out. The screen was on, even though I hadn't touched it. The time read 2:44 a.m. I knew that wasn't right. I'd only been there maybe 20 minutes, and it was barely past midnight when I started. I hit the home button. The screen flickered, then went black. The phone rebooted itself. When the screen lit back up, the reflections vanished. Not faded, gone instantly, like someone snapped their fingers. The water rippled again, as if released from whatever held it still. The reflective quality disappeared. My fishing bobber bounced on the surface. Everything went back to normal so abruptly I almost doubted I'd seen anything at all. Then my phone finished booting. The time said 1:07 a.m. Normal. Battery at 72%. No notifications. Just the sudden, unsettling sense that something had reset itself. I turned the lantern back on. The beam looked weak at first, then steadied. I checked the shoreline again, the sky, the water, nothing unusual. The hazy stars were exactly where they belonged. The distant houses were quiet. But the dock felt different. Not physically, just in the way you sense someone has left a room a moment before you walk in. A kind of absence heavy enough to notice. I reeled in my line, packed my gear, and walked off the dock faster than I meant to. I didn't hear anything behind me, no splash, no movement, but halfway to the car, I stopped and looked back. The lake surface was normal again. Except in the reflection of one of the house's porch lights, I saw a faint drifting glow that didn't match anything in the air. Just a soft smear of light sliding sideways across the water. When I looked directly at the spot above it, there was only darkness. I didn't stay to see if it moved again. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove home with the radio off the whole way. I didn't go fishing at night again for a long time after that, and I was driving back to Pueblo from Alamosa late on a Sunday night, taking Highway 160 because I wanted to avoid I-25 traffic. It was close to 11 p.m., cold and dry, the kind of night where the sky looks higher than usual and the air feels thinner. I'd worked a double shift at the hotel and was exhausted enough that the empty road felt almost calming. Just me, my old Subaru, and miles of dark fields broken up by the occasional ranch light way off in the distance. I first saw the orb near the turnoff for Fort Garland. It wasn't dramatic, just a pale circle of light floating over the field to my right, steady and soft like a dim lantern suspended about 20 feet above the ground. I thought it was a yard light at first, but it wasn't attached to anything. No pole, no building under it, just hovering in the open space. I'd driven that stretch plenty of times and didn't remember anything being there. I kept going, waiting for the angle of the road to make it disappear behind a hill, but the orb stayed visible through the passenger window. It matched my speed almost perfectly. If I sped up a little, it kept up. If I eased off the gas, it did too. I turned off my music and cracked the window. The air rushing in was freezing, but I wanted to hear if it made any sound. I didn't hear anything except the wind and the hum of my tires. For a moment, I convinced myself it was some kind of nighttime farm equipment. Those big irrigation rigs have lights sometimes, but those move slowly and stay close to the ground. Plus, this light was too round, too clean at the edges, and way too detached from anything physical. It paced me for maybe 2 miles before something changed. I switched on my high beams. The orb didn't brighten or dim in response. It just stayed exactly the same. Same color, same glow, same position, like my headlights weren't affecting the environment around it at all. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I gripped the wheel harder and kept glancing between the road and the orb. The land out there is just rolling fields and low brush, not much else. Nothing the orb could hide behind if it wanted to. But it never moved closer. It didn't zigzag or wobble, just the same calm drifting at a constant distance. Eventually, curiosity beat out fear, and I slowed down gently, letting the speedometer dip from 62 to around 45. The orb didn't keep pacing me this time. Instead, it rose straight up, not fast, just a smooth vertical climb like it was on an invisible track. I leaned forward over the steering wheel without meaning to, watching it go higher and higher until it was maybe 100 feet up. Then it vanished. No blink, no fade, no shrinking into the distance, just gone. I let the car roll for a few seconds before speeding back up. I didn't want to stay near whatever that was any longer than I had to. But the more distance I put between myself and that stretch of highway, the more aware I became of something that hadn't seemed odd at first. The road was completely empty. Not unusual for late Sunday nights, but there wasn't a single car coming toward me or behind me. No trucks, no RVs, just dark road and the faint glow of stars through the windshield. I kept checking the rearview mirror. Nothing. About 10 minutes later, I passed a reflective road sign, and for a split second, the reflection looked wrong. Instead of the usual sharp white shine, it stretched upward, like the light from my headlights was being pulled vertically. It snapped back to normal before I'd fully registered what I'd seen. I told myself my eyes were tired, that I'd been driving too long. Another couple miles passed. I started seeing faint flickers on the horizon. Not lightning, just soft pulses of light near ground level. They didn't illuminate anything around them, so it was hard to tell how far away they were. They might have been a ranch's security system or some kind of distant equipment, but they faded too quickly and appeared too randomly. My phone buzzed in the cup holder, lighting up the interior for a second. No service. Which made no sense, because I usually had at least a bar or two on that highway. Even if it wasn't enough to browse anything, texts would usually come through. I tried refreshing it. Nothing changed. Then the radio cut on. Static first, faint and crackly, before settling into a low hum that didn't match any station. The display said 87.7, which I hadn't tuned to. I reached out to turn it off, but the second my fingers touched the dial, the static jumped in volume, like someone had pushed the volume button instead. I jerked my hand back. The static died completely. Silence again. The car's heater made a soft clicking noise as it switched modes. I hadn't touched the controls. The orb didn't reappear, but I kept glancing at the fields to my right anyway, half expecting it to drift back into view. Every time my headlights swept across the brush, the shadows looked a little too crisp, like the contrast was turned up unnaturally. When I passed the big bend approaching Walsenburg, the air pressure in the car shifted, ears popping, a soft tightening in my head. I checked the vents again, but nothing had changed. It wasn't the heater. It felt external, like the entire environment outside dropped or rose in pressure. I slowed down, trying to figure out if I'd driven into some kind of weather front. That's when my headlights dimmed. Not burned out, just dimmed evenly, as if the power was being lowered. The road ahead went gray, the reflective stripes less bright. I tapped the high beam switch and got nothing. The dashboard lights flickered once but didn't go out. I was gripping the wheel so hard my hands hurt. Everything went back to normal all at once. Headlights bright again, dashboard steady, pressure gone. I took a long breath and felt my pulse finally start to steady. The rest of the drive into Pueblo was quiet, almost too quiet. The moment I crossed into the city, my phone buzzed again, service restored, notifications popping in all at once. 3 texts from my sister, 2 from my coworker, all time-stamped during the period my phone said it had no service. I got home, Parked and sat in the car with the engine off for a moment. The interior of the Subaru felt like it normally did. Warm from the heater, faint smell of old coffee, radio quiet. I checked the passenger window out of habit. Only my reflection. I went inside, dropped my keys on the counter, and poured a glass of water. When I set the glass down, I noticed something on the back of my hand in the overhead light. A faint residue. Pale and dusty, like dried pollen, except it didn't smear. It brushed off in tiny flakes. I didn't remember touching anything outside the car. I checked my jacket sleeve, the same faint residue near the cuff. I looked in my bathroom mirror under brighter lighting and noticed a tiny vertical streak down the left lens of my glasses, like something had touched them. I wiped it once with a microfiber cloth. It didn't come off. I wiped again, harder. Only then did the streak disappear. I set my glasses down on the sink and leaned on the counter with my palms, trying to slow my breathing. My phone buzzed on the counter behind me. New system message available. I picked it up. The notification disappeared before I could tap it. The phone screen returned to normal. Battery at 68%. Signal strong. I went to bed after that, but I slept with the curtains open and the bedside lamp on low. I didn't see the orb again. But a few days later, when I drove the same stretch of Highway 160 during daylight, I noticed something odd right around the area where it had paced my car. The fields on the right side looked normal except for one thing. A circle of grass, maybe 30 feet across, was bent slightly inward, like it had been pressed by a gentle weight that lifted before leaving a full impression. Not enough to notice unless you were looking for it. I slowed the car and looked at it as long as I could before the curve of the road forced me forward. The circle was perfectly round, too round for wind, too round for cattle, and right about the same distance from the road where the orb had floated alongside me, keeping pace without ever getting closer. I was outside on my porch in Helena when the power went out. It was late September, already cold enough that my breath fogged a little, and the wind smelled like wet leaves after an afternoon drizzle. My neighbor, Marcus, had warned me earlier that the transformer on our block had been making a weird buzzing sound, so when the lights in my house snapped off all at once, I figured that was the explanation. The blackout wasn't just my building. The entire street went dark. Every porch light, every window, even the stoplight at the end of the block. The silence afterward felt strange. No refrigerator hum, no HVC units, no traffic. Even the usual dogs in the distance had gone quiet. I stepped off the porch and walked into the yard, mostly out of boredom. My phone screen lit up automatically when I checked it, but the battery symbol flickered like it couldn't decide what level it was at. The screen brightness dipped once, then stabilized. No signal, no Wi-Fi, nothing. I stood there, staring down the empty street, hands in my jacket pockets. The sky was completely overcast. Thick, low clouds that reflected the town's normal light pollution. Except now, there was no light for them to reflect. Everything was darker than I'd ever seen it in the city. The only illumination came from faint orange glows in distant windows where people had candles or flashlights. Then the clouds above me shifted color. It started subtle, a pale tint, almost like moonlight behind them, but cooler. Bluer. I thought maybe lightning was building inside the cloud bank, but there was no thunder and no flicker, just a spreading, steady glow that seemed to come from above the clouds rather than inside them. I tilted my head back fully. The entire cloud layer overhead glowed faintly blue, like someone had laid a giant LED panel across the sky. It wasn't bright enough to light the ground, but it gave everything a weird, washed-out look. The edges of houses, trees, fences, they all looked flat, like shadows couldn't decide where to fall. The glow brightened for a moment. Not glaring, just enough that the silhouette of the ridge west of town stood out against it. The line of pine trees looked sharper than they should have through thick clouds. I called out automatically, "Marcus?" thinking he might be outside too. No answer. His house was still dark. I tried taking a picture with my phone. When I opened the camera app, the screen hung on a black preview for a few seconds before showing a pale smear where the sky should have been. The blue glow didn't register at all, like the camera just refused to pick it up. As I stood there, I realized something strange. The wind had stopped. Completely. The clouds weren't moving. Not even a tiny shift. The leaves in the trees were still, even though I'd heard them rustling minutes earlier. Then a soft humming sound drifted in from somewhere above the clouds. It wasn't mechanical exactly, more like a sustained vibration, low and smooth, almost like standing next to a huge tuning fork. The sound wasn't directional. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It seemed to fill the air evenly. The blue glow pulsed once, just barely, like someone dimming a light and bringing it back up. I felt a prickling sensation on my arms, even through my jacket. Not static electricity, more like a subtle pressure shift. My porch light suddenly flicked on, just for a second. A quick white flash, like it had received one burst of power, then dead again. The bulb made a faint pinging sound as it cooled in the cold air. The humming above deepened slightly. I looked around at my neighbors' houses. A few porch lights flickered in the same way, random single flashes. None stayed on. The blue glow overhead spread wider, stretching across the sky in every direction until even the horizon had that faint tint. It reminded me of those rare times when the northern lights show up this far south, but this wasn't shimmering or dancing. It was too consistent, too uniform. The hum got louder for a moment. Not painfully loud, just more present, like it had moved closer. Then it stopped. The glow began to fade almost immediately. Not drop out, but recede, like someone was slowly turning a dial. The center dimmed first, then the outer edges. The silhouettes of the ridge and the trees softened. The sky went from blue to gray to pitch black again. Within seconds, the glow was gone. The street looked completely normal, just a quiet neighborhood in the dark, no different from any other blackout night. The wind picked back up, brushing through the trees. A dog barked somewhere behind the next row of houses, like sound had been muted and suddenly returned. The moment the last trace of the glow disappeared, every house on the street lit up at once. Streetlights flashed back on, porch lights, living room windows. My house. Even the stoplight at the intersection blinked to life, red first, then cycling like it always did. My phone regained signal a second later, vibrating with old notifications. The battery symbol stabilized at 52%. I stood there staring up at the dark, quiet sky, waiting for some sign the glow would return, but the clouds looked normal again, just the usual heavy overcast. Nothing on the horizon, nothing drifting behind the clouds, nothing unusual. I headed back into my house, but something made me hesitate before closing the front door. The grass in my yard was faintly flattened in a circular pattern, maybe 10 feet across. Not crushed like something heavy had sat there, but bent, as if a mild pressure had pressed down evenly over the surface. The dew glinted strangely on the blades, and when I crouched to touch them, they were colder than the surrounding grass. I straightened up and looked at the sky again. Still nothing. No glow. No hum. Not even a break in the clouds. Inside, every clock in my house was blinking the wrong time, completely out of sync. The oven was 10 minutes fast. The microwave was 15 minutes slow. My router showed 12 a.m. like it had rebooted. Even my alarm clock, the one with a battery backup, blinked 3:17 a.m. I walked room to room, listening to the house settle back into its normal sounds. The heater clicked on. The fridge compressor started humming again. The floorboards made their usual popping sound as the temperature changed. Everything sounded right, but the air still felt wrong. Not colder or warmer, just expectant, like something had been overhead watching and the silence it left behind was still settling into place. I went back outside one last time, just to check. The wind was moving normally. The clouds were dark again. The flattened circle in the yard was already starting to rise back up. And the sky, completely quiet, completely empty, looked exactly like it had before the power went out. Except I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever caused that blue glow hadn't moved on, just stopped showing itself. I woke up because my bedroom felt too quiet. Normally I could hear the fridge humming in the kitchen or the water heater kicking on in the basement, but the house in Madison felt dead still, like the silence had weight to it. I rolled over to check the time on my phone. 4:58 a.m. I frowned. I knew I'd set an alarm for 7, but it wasn't going off. I unlocked the screen just to make sure I hadn't messed something up, and the moment the home screen loaded, the time shifted to 3:12 a.m. I stared at it, confused. I locked it and unlocked it again. Now it said 5:41 a.m. I sat up fast. The air in the room felt colder than when I went to bed, and I got the immediate sense something was off, like I'd walked into the wrong version of my house. I grabbed my phone, walked into the hallway, and checked the clock by the bathroom door. It was an old battery one I'd bought at a yard sale, usually slow by a minute or two, but reliable enough. 22:27. I actually laughed under my breath because it didn't make any sense. I went to the kitchen and checked the microwave. 7:52. The stove said 6:03. The coffee maker said 4:11. Every single device in the house showed a different time. None of them matched my phone. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, trying to figure out if there had been a power outage during the night. That wouldn't explain the battery-powered wall clock being wrong, but the rest could have blinked out and come back, except most of them were ahead, not behind. And not by the same amount either. I checked my phone again. It said 4:58 a.m. again, like it had looped back. Then the screen flickered and jumped to 5:12. I turned it off immediately. The second the screen went dark, the fridge kicked on like someone had flipped a breaker. I walked to the back door, opened it a crack, and stuck my hand out. The air outside felt normal for April. Damp, mild, nothing strange. No storm, no wind, nothing that should have messed with the power. When I closed the door, the kitchen light flickered. Just once. A soft dimming, like the bulb got tired for a second. I blew out a slow breath and checked my laptop on the dining table. It had gone to sleep overnight. I opened it. The lock screen loaded, and the time said 8:44 a.m. I hadn't been asleep that long. My body didn't feel it. My eyes weren't dry. I didn't feel groggy the way I do when I oversleep. And the sun wasn't up. I turned on the living room lamp. The bulb glowed normally for half a second, then brightened sharply, then settled into a dimmer level than before. I unplugged it. I didn't want to touch the knob. When I looked out the living room window, the street looked normal. A few porch lights on across the way. A car driving somewhere a block over. No weird glow in the sky, no strange fog. Everything looked completely ordinary. But the times weren't. I went back into the kitchen and opened the drawer with spare batteries. I swapped out the ones in the wall clock. When I put it back on the hook, the second hand started ticking and then stuttered like it was catching on something. It moved, paused, jumped forward, paused again, then spun quickly in a half circle before stopping altogether. I took it down again, heart pounding in a way I couldn't justify. I stared at the unmoving hands. They pointed to 3:19. Not any time it had shown before. The room felt colder again. Not freezing, just noticeably wrong for spring. I stepped toward the thermostat and checked it. It said 68 degrees, same as usual. I bumped it up to 70 and waited. No sound. No warm air. After 5 seconds, the screen faded slightly, like the backlight was dying. I stepped back. The basement door creaked. Not fully open, just a tiny shift in the frame, enough to make the hinge groan. That door never moved on its own. It stuck unless you pulled it. I stared at it, waiting. Nothing else happened. The cold feeling didn't fade, though. It settled in the air like mist you couldn't see. I walked into the living room again, more to get away from the basement than anything else, and checked the old VCR clock under the TV. I hadn't used that thing in years, but the time always stayed blinking at 12 unless I set it manually. Now it said 9:33. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I didn't know what else to do except turn on the TV to see if a news channel showed the real time. I grabbed the remote and hit the power button. The screen glowed gray. Not black like usual before a channel loads. Gray with faint bands of darker shade drifting across horizontally. No sound. No menu. I hit the power button again. The screen stayed gray for another second before cutting to black. The power light on the TV stayed on. I unplugged it. In the silence that followed, something upstairs creaked. I froze. My house was a single story, no upstairs. The attic was low and cramped, used only for insulation and storage, and the only access point was sealed with screws. The creak came again, slow. A shift in weight, like a board bending under something. I backed toward the hallway, feeling my hands start to shake. The microwave beeped. I spun around, startled hard enough that I almost slipped on the rug. The microwave door was slightly ajar. I hadn't touched it. The display now said 12:06. Different again. I shut the door gently and stepped away. My phone, lying on the counter, vibrated even though I'd turned it off. The screen lit up, not fully, just a glow without icons. When the home screen finally appeared, the clock showed 2:58, then 4:22, then 7:07, then 5:01. The seconds didn't change, only the minutes. I held the power button until it shut off again. The fridge's compressor suddenly stopped. The kitchen went quiet. Then the living room lamp unplugged, flickered once. Just a faint glow inside the bulb like a dying ember. That was when I grabbed my jacket and shoes and stood near the front door, willing myself to leave. I didn't want to stay in the house anymore. But the moment I touched the deadbolt, something made me freeze. The digital clock on the stove beeped again. The numbers were scrolling this time. Not cycling like they do when the power comes back, but scrolling upward quickly, as if time was being fast-forwarded. 6:10, 6:11, 6:12, 6:13. I stepped back from it. The scrolling slowed, then stopped on 6:14. The microwave changed to 8:02. The coffee maker blinked 3:55. My phone buzzed even though it was powered down. The attic creaked again. I don't know what pushed me to walk back toward the hallway, but I did. I stood under the attic hatch and listened. No movement, no sound, just the faint static in my ears from fear more than anything. Then the thermostat let out a faint click. I looked at it. The temperature readout now said 243. Not degrees, just 243 with no unit symbol. Then it blinked to 11:19. Then 5:02. I reached for it, but stopped myself before touching anything. Something in the walls hummed, a soft electrical vibration that I felt more than heard. It pulsed once, twice, 3 times. Then everything went still. No hum, no creaking, no flickering lights. The kitchen display on the stove froze at 6:14. The microwave held at 8:02. The VCR still glowed 9:33. The wall clock remained unmoving in my hands, stuck at 3:19. I don't know how long I stood there before the heater finally kicked on like nothing had happened. Warm air started flowing through the vents. The fridge hummed back to life. A car drove by outside, normal as ever. I checked my phone again, letting it boot up fully this time. 7:06 a.m., the correct time. All my notifications showed normal timestamps. The signal was strong. The battery was stable. Nothing glitched. I walked through the house again. Every device was still wrong, each one showing a different time, but none of them were changing anymore. I opened the blinds to let in some of the early morning light, and the moment the sunlight hit the kitchen floor, the cold feeling lifted, like someone had cracked open a window on a stuffy day. I didn't try to fix any of the clocks. I didn't reset anything. I just left them the way they were. Every device frozen. At a different minute of a morning I had no memory of living. My friend Jonah was the one who noticed the light first. He called me a little after 10 p.m. on a Thursday, sounding weirdly calm for what he was saying. "Hey man," he said, "are you home right now?" "Yeah," I said. "Why?" "You might want to look outside. There's a light hovering above your neighborhood." I thought he was joking. Jonah liked messing with people, and he knew I lived in a quiet part of Greenville, the kind of area where the wildest thing you see is a loose dog or a teenager speeding in a hand-me-down Ford. But something in his voice sounded off. Not scared, just cautious. "What kind of light?" I asked. There was a pause long enough that I thought the call dropped. "It's just hanging there," he finally said. "Not moving. I can see it from my porch." Jonah lived 3 streets south of me. Whatever he was seeing had to be big, or at least bright. I walked to my front window and peeked through the blinds. All I saw were the same things as always. The oak tree across the street, Mrs. Dean's porch lamp, the faint yellow glow from the street light on the corner. Nothing unusual. "I don't see anything," I told him. "Go outside," he said. "Just step out and look up. It might be right over your block." He sounded genuinely uneasy. That alone pushed me to grab my hoodie and step out onto the porch. The night was warm enough that I didn't need the hoodie, but habit made me pull it on anyway. The street was quiet, just the hum of a distant AC unit and a cicada in one of the yards. The air smelled like someone had cut their lawn earlier. I stepped out onto the grass and looked up. The light was there. A pale white sphere, maybe the size of a basketball from where I stood, hovering directly above my house. It was too steady to be a drone, no wobbling, no blinking pattern. It wasn't overly bright either, just enough to glow softly through the thin layer of humidity. I couldn't see any structure around it. No lines, no body, nothing casting it. It just floated. Jonah, I said into the phone, yeah. Okay, I see it now. Is it right over you? Feels like it. I couldn't judge the height. It might have been 100 feet up, maybe more. The sky was too hazy to tell, but it wasn't casting much light downward. My yard wasn't lit up. My roof wasn't glowing. It seemed self-contained, like the light was meant only to be seen from below. As I watched, I got a weird sensation in my ears, like pressure shifting. Not painful, just noticeable. The cicada stopped buzzing. The AC hum down the street cut out. Every background sound dropped away at once, leaving the neighborhood unnervingly still. Dude, Jonah said softly, it just dimmed on my end. Did it dim for you? I squinted. The light did look slightly fainter, like someone had turned the brightness down a notch. Then it brightened again. Not a lot, but enough that I stepped back instinctively. What the hell? I whispered. As soon as I said that, my porch light flickered. Once. Quick. Then the street light on the corner flickered too. Are your lights doing that? Jonah asked. Yeah. I felt something then. Not vibration, but presence. Like the air around me had weight. The hairs on my arms stood up under my hoodie. I kept staring at the orb, waiting for it to move sideways or upward or anything. It didn't. It hung there perfectly still, as if observing or adjusting. I realized then that none of the trees were moving. No breeze, no rustle. The leaves looked frozen in place. I think it's right over my roof, I whispered. It's not moving at all. Go back inside, Jonah said immediately. Seriously. But I didn't. I stepped farther into the yard for a clearer view. The orb flickered again. Not like a dying light, more like a pulse. A quick contraction of brightness followed by a longer glow. Then it shifted color for a split second, turning the faintest blue before returning to white. The pressure in my ears deepened. My phone connection crackled. Hello? Jonah said. Man, are you still? The call dropped. I lowered the phone and looked at it. No service. Full bars one moment, nothing the next. The orb dimmed again. This time it didn't brighten afterward. It stayed faint, shrinking slightly around the edges like the glow was collapsing inward. Then it started to descend. Just a few feet. Slowly. Not enough to be dramatic, but enough that I stumbled backward toward the porch steps. The pressure in my ears eased up for a moment, then returned stronger. My porch light flickered again, this time staying dim for a second before stabilizing. Okay, I muttered. Heart pounding. Okay. I reached the door, hand on the knob, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Curiosity pinned me in place. I kept watching. The orb stopped descending. It hovered again at its new height, maybe 20 or 30 feet lower than before. It didn't move sideways. It didn't rotate. It didn't behave like anything that should exist in the air without support. Then it flickered sharply, like a camera shutter. Once, twice. Each flicker came with a tiny delay, like it was syncing with something I couldn't hear. My phone screen lit up even though I wasn't touching it. It displayed the time, 10:48 p.m. Then the numbers glitched, shifting to 3:12 p.m., then 12 a.m., then back to 10:48. The screen froze, then went black. I didn't have time to react. The orb suddenly dimmed faster, shrinking to a pinpoint of light the size of a star. Then it faded completely. Not shot upward, not drifted away, just faded, like someone erased it from the sky. Sound returned instantly, the cicada buzzing, the AC hum, a car in the distance, like someone had turned the neighborhood back on. The pressure in my ears vanished. The breeze returned, rustling the leaves softly. My porch lights steadied. Everything snapped back into place. Jonah called again. You still outside? He asked, breathless. Yeah, it's gone. Gone how? It just faded. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then, it looked like it blinked out from here. 1 second it was there, the next it just wasn't. I walked back into the yard, standing roughly where I'd been when the orb hovered above me. The sky looked normal now, just haze and the faint orange glow of the city. But something was off. The grass beneath my feet was flattened in a circular pattern, maybe 8 or 9 feet wide. Not crushed, just gently pressed, like something had hovered low enough for the air pressure to push it down. In the center, the blades were bent inward. I've got something in my yard, I told him. A pattern. Looks fresh. You think it landed? I didn't see anything land. I crouched down and touched the grass. It was cold, colder than the rest of the yard. Not wet, not frost, just unnaturally chilled. I'm coming over, Jonah said. No, I said immediately. "Stay home, there's nothing to see now." But he came anyway. By the time he pulled up, the circle in the yard was already rising back up, the grass slowly straightening like nothing had touched it. He saw the tail end of it, but not the shape it had been. We stood in the yard for a long minute, both of us staring at the empty sky. "Do you hear that?" Jonah asked quietly. "Hear what?" He shook his head. "Nothing. That's the weird part." Because the cicada had stopped again, and the wind was still. The neighborhood went quiet a second time, but only for a moment. Then sound returned again, just as quickly. We didn't talk after that. Jonah went home. I went inside and locked the door without really thinking about it. Later that night, when I checked my phone again, the time was normal and the service was back. But one thing stood out that hadn't been there before. In my call history, right between Jonah's two calls was a missed call from an unknown number. Timestamp 10:47 p.m., 1 minute before the light faded. The number had no digits, just a blank space. I heard the footsteps around 12:40 a.m. It had been one of those long, restless nights where nothing felt comfortable, so I was lying awake in my bed in my little house outside Mapleton, listening to the baseboard heater click and the occasional car on the county road. The night was cold, mid-January, with snow piled against the fence, but the wind had totally died, and the house felt still in a way it rarely did. The first sound was faint. Just a soft thump directly above me. I figured it was snow sliding or maybe a branch dropping. But then another thump followed, a little farther toward the center of the roof. Then another, spaced like someone taking slow, heavy steps. 3 in total. I sat up immediately. My house was small enough that any noise on the roof carried through the beams, but these didn't sound like settling wood or shifting snow. They were deliberate, measured, something moving. Millie, my old terrier mix, lifted her head from the foot of the bed and stared at the ceiling with her ears pinned back. She didn't bark, she just listened, tense. I held my breath, waiting for more sounds. Nothing. Just silence, thick enough to feel in my chest. I slipped out of bed and walked softly to the window. The snow outside reflected the faint porch light, giving everything a dull glow, but nothing looked disturbed. The trees along the property line were still. No wind. No snow falling from branches. I pressed my forehead to the cold glass and waited. Nothing moved on the roof. No one could be up there. The snow had been too powdery all week. Anyone walking on it would leave a clear trail. I almost convinced myself it had been an animal, maybe a raccoon, when something else caught my attention. The sky looked uneven. Off to the northwest, above the tree line, the darkness had a faint, bright spot. Not bright like a street light or someone's yard lamp. More like the night sky had been rubbed with a lighter shade. A subtle, hazy patch, maybe the size of an outstretched palm at arm's length. I stepped back from the window and blinked a few times, thinking it was my eyes adjusting. But the brighter patch stayed. It wasn't moving either, just hanging there, dull but noticeable against the winter clouds. I glanced at my clock, 12:47 now, and went to the back door. I didn't want to go outside, but staying in the house made me feel trapped. I grabbed my boots and jacket and cracked the door open. Cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. Millie stood next to me, whining softly. I stepped onto the porch and shut the door behind me, tugging my jacket tight. The night was quiet in a way I'd never heard before. No engine sounds from far-off farms, no barking dogs. Even the usual hum of the power lines seemed muted. I looked up toward the bright patch. It didn't glow like a star behind the clouds. It was too diffused, almost like someone had shone a flashlight onto the underside of the sky. The brightness didn't pulse or shift, just stayed where it was, a fixed smudge against the dark. Then I heard another noise, not on the roof this time, from above, but lower than the sky. A soft scraping sound like something dragging lightly against aluminum. It came from the direction of the bright spot, but didn't echo the way sound usually did in the cold. It felt close, too close. I turned slowly, scanning the top of the house, but the roof was invisible from where I stood. All I saw was the snow-covered yard and the trees at the edge of the property. The scraping sound stopped. My porch light flickered. Not out, just a quick dip in brightness. I froze. When the light steadied again, the bright patch in the sky dimmed slightly. Not enough to disappear, just enough that the contrast shifted. I tried to convince myself there was some logical explanation. Maybe the clouds were thinner in that spot. Maybe light from a distant town was bouncing strangely. But nothing made sense with the footsteps I'd heard. I stepped into the yard, boots crunching through the crusted snow. The air felt heavier the farther I got from the house. Millie scratched at the door behind me, whining louder now. I looked back up at the bright spot. It seemed lower. Not a lot, maybe a handful of feet in perspective, but enough that my stomach dropped. I stood perfectly still, watching. The brightness didn't flicker or pulse. It just continued to hang there. A single, motionless patch of lighter sky. Something shifted behind the trees at the edge of my property. Not a shape, just a suggestion of movement. A slight distortion, as if the air wavered. I held my breath, waiting for an animal to emerge, but nothing came out. The distortion faded as quickly as I'd noticed it. I backed toward the house. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I jumped, nearly slipping on the snow. I pulled it out with numb fingers and looked at the screen. No service. It shouldn't have said that. I always had at least 2 bars at home, even during storms. The porch light dimmed again. This time it stayed dim a full second before brightening back to normal. As the brightness returned, the faint light in the sky flickered, twice quick, and then faded. Not gradually, instantly. One moment it was there, a ghostly patch behind the clouds. The next it was gone, leaving only uniform darkness. The quiet around me intensified, then cracked as the wind picked up sharply, rattling the branches overhead. Millie barked once from inside, desperate for me to come back. I ran to the door, slipped inside, and locked it behind me. For the next few minutes, the house groaned softly as the wind hit, like normal winter nights. Millie followed me room to room as I checked the windows, but nothing looked unusual anymore. The sky was fully dark now, the clouds blending seamlessly. When I finally calmed down enough to sit on the couch, I replayed the footsteps in my head. They'd sounded too heavy for an animal, too spaced to be settling snow, too deliberate. I considered going outside again to look for tracks on the roof, but the idea made my skin crawl. I waited until morning instead, when the sun was up and everything felt safer. In daylight, I dragged a ladder from the shed and climbed up carefully. The roof was smooth, no footprints, no disturbed snow, no signs anything had been up there at all. But near the center of the roof, right where the second thump had sounded, the snow was different. Not melted exactly, but compressed, a shallow depression, almost perfectly oval, maybe a foot long, no other marks around it. I scraped it gently with my glove. The layer underneath wasn't icy or hardened. It felt like normal snow, just pressed evenly by something that hadn't left a tread or a shape. When I stepped down from the ladder, I looked out at the northwest sky. Normal clouds, normal winter haze. Nothing strange, but the memory of that brighter patch, the way it hung there, the scraping sound that followed, nagged at me in a way I couldn't shake. That night, Millie refused to sleep at the foot of the bed. She curled up against my side instead, facing the window. And even though I told myself I was being paranoid, I kept the blinds closed and the porch light on until morning. I was walking my dog, Millie, around 9:30 p.m. in my neighborhood in Franklin. It was one of those warm Tennessee nights where the humidity sticks to your clothes and the air smells like grass and asphalt cooling from the day. It had rained earlier, so everything still had that damp shine under the streetlights. Millie was sniffing every mailbox like usual, and I was half zoned out, scrolling through old texts. The insects were loud, crickets, tree frogs, whatever else lives in the drains around here. They always get louder at night after rain. I didn't pay attention to them at first. It was just background noise I'd heard a million times. Then all of it stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Every chirp, croak, whine, buzz, gone in an instant, like someone muted the whole neighborhood. Even Millie froze mid-sniff, lifting her head quick like she'd heard something I hadn't. The leash tightened in my hand because she didn't move forward. At first, I thought maybe a car door slammed somewhere, or someone nearby made a loud noise that startled the insects all at once. But I hadn't heard anything. The silence felt thick, heavy, wrong. I turned in a slow circle, trying to see if anything obvious had changed. All the houses looked normal. Porch lights, garages, sprinklers running down the block, a TV flickering in one living room. Nothing out of place. That's when I noticed the red glow. It wasn't bright, more like the faint red you see on the back of an airplane, except it didn't blink. It drifted slowly between the rooftops across the street, about 1 story above them, almost like it was following the property lines. Not flying high overhead, not zooming, just drifting sideways as if it were floating through the air on a lazy path. I blinked hard, thinking maybe it was someone's drone. Plenty of people in the neighborhood have them. But drones vibrate and buzz. Even the quiet ones make noise, and they don't usually drift that slowly or that steadily unless someone's purposefully creeping them along. This red glow didn't have the shape of a drone light either. It wasn't a single point. It was a little blurry around the edges, almost like a glowing ember held behind frosted glass. Millie let out a low whine and sat down abruptly, tail tucked. She's usually fearless. She's barked at raccoons twice her size, but now she wouldn't move. I tugged the leash gently, but she wouldn't budge. "Come on," I whispered. "It's okay." But I didn't really believe that. The red glow continued drifting over the rooftops, gliding toward the end of the block. I squinted at it, trying to make sense of it. It didn't illuminate the shingles or reflect off windows. It just existed, like the light didn't interact with anything around it. As it passed between 2 houses, the glow stretched slightly, almost like it warped for a second. A vertical shimmer rippled through it, then it returned to its normal shape and kept moving. The urge to step backward hit me hard, and I actually did. One small step. The air felt wrong. Not colder or warmer, just unusually still, like every molecule had paused with the insects. I reached for my phone to record it, but the screen didn't respond at first. It lit up, then froze on the lock screen. The time displayed fine, battery normal, but the touch screen lagged like it was underwater. By the time I got to the camera app, the glow had slowed and hovered near the edge of the block, right above the Petersons' house. For a second, it stopped drifting entirely. It just hung there, unmoving, faint but solid. I couldn't look away. Then I realized something even stranger. The glow wasn't casting light onto the air around it. I could see the space behind it clearly. No halo, no brightness leaking outward. The red was contained, sharp-edged despite being blurry, like a self-contained bubble of color. Right when I took a cautious step forward, the glow pulsed. A single, dim pulse. Then it faded. Not dropped, not zipped away. It simply thinned out until it was a tiny point, then nothing, like it dissolved into the night air. As soon as it vanished, the insects started up again. All at once. The noise came back so suddenly that I flinched. Millie jolted to her feet, tail still low, but ready to move again. The cicadas buzzed, the crickets chirped, and the tree frogs croaked like they were trying to make up for the lost time. I stood there breathing shallowly, trying to make sense of what I saw. A car drove past at the far end of the street, its headlights sweeping the pavement. Nothing unusual happened. The driver didn't slow down or look confused. It was like everything was back to normal. But the silence had lasted long enough that my ears still rang slightly. Millie pulled toward home, which she never does that early in the walk. I didn't fight her. We hurried back down the sidewalk, and the closer we got to my house, the more normal everything felt. The noise, the smell of wet grass, the distant sound of a truck on the main road, everything snapped back into place. But when I reached my driveway, something made me stop. My front yard looked the same as always. Garden bed, walkway, porch light. But the air above it felt displaced. Like walking into a spot where the temperature should change, except it didn't. More like the sensation of static without the actual static. Millie refused to step off the sidewalk. She braced her legs and stared at the yard with her ears flat. I picked her up to carry her in, and she didn't resist, which scared me more than anything else that night. Inside the house, everything seemed normal. The lights didn't flicker. My phone worked fine. The router blinked like usual. I sat on the couch holding Millie, scrolling through neighborhood posts, half expecting someone else to mention the blackout of insect noise or a weird red light overhead. Nothing. Nobody said a thing. About an hour later, I took Millie out back for her final bathroom break. She trotted out like nothing happened, sniffing the grass, tail up again. I felt a little silly for being so rattled earlier. But when I glanced up, just a casual glance while waiting, something caught my eye. Not a glow this time, just a faint streak of red along the low clouds, almost too quick to register. Not lightning, not airplane lights, more like a residual reflection fading out. I blinked and it was gone. I stayed outside a few seconds longer, out off listening to the insects hit their usual rhythms. The noise comforted me in a way it never had before. Eventually, I went inside, locked the door, and checked the time one more time on my phone. It briefly flashed 3:09 a.m., then corrected itself to 10:54 p.m. Millie followed me to bed and curled up closer than usual, right against my ribs. I didn't sleep much. Not because I was scared something would come back, but because I kept replaying the moment the insects went silent. How absolute it was. How it felt like everything living in the neighborhood was holding its breath all at the same time. Right before the red light drifted between the rooftops. I was driving back from my sister's place in Yakima, late on a Sunday night, taking Highway 12 through the mountains. It was cold enough that the patches of leftover snow along the guardrails looked frozen solid, but the sky was clear and the road was empty. I'd left later than planned around 10:30 p.m. because we'd gotten caught up talking, and by the time I hit the long stretch near Rimrock Lake, there wasn't another pair of headlights in sight. I had my dash cam running like always. Not because I expected anything, just because I drove that road often enough to know deer like to dart out of nowhere. The hum of the engine mixed with low radio static, no stations came through clearly out there, and the tires made that soft, vibrating sound against the old pavement. I wasn't tired, just settled into that late-night driving headspace where everything feels quieter than it should. Then the flash happened. It was so fast I barely understood what I saw. 1 second the road ahead was the pale gray of my headlights cutting through the dark, and the next it was completely washed out in white. Not like high beams hitting a fog bank. This was clean, pure white, like somebody held a studio strobe directly in front of the car. The dashboard, the windshield, even my hands on the wheel turned paper white for a split second. My first instinct was that a car was cresting a hill, brights on. But there was no glare pattern, no source, no rise in the road where lights could appear. The brightness wasn't directional. It filled the entire windshield at once, edge to edge. Then, it was gone. Just darkness and my headlights again, like nothing had happened. I jerked the wheel slightly from surprise, then corrected. The car handled normally. No sound accompanied the flash. Not even a buzzing or a pop. Just the quiet hum of the engine returning as if the world had paused briefly. My heart was pounding hard enough that I turned the radio down, even though it was barely audible. I kept one eye on the rearview mirror, expecting some kind of headlights behind me. Nothing. Just black. I pulled onto the next turnout, a gravel patch overlooking the lake, and threw the car into park. My breath fogged the interior. I checked the dash cam first. The screen showed the road, frozen mid-frame where the flash happened. I tapped the playback. The recorded footage went from normal night driving to a single pure white frame. No fade in, no fade out, just one fully whited out frame. Then the image returned to normal. But the timestamp jumped. Before the flash. Before the flash, teen. After the flash, 11:45. More than 2 minutes missing. I watched it 3 times, double checking. The dash cam recorded continuously with no gaps and no jumps unless power was cut. But it hadn't powered down. I'd felt no flicker in the dashboard lights, no interruption in the engine. Everything in the car had stayed perfectly steady. I checked the car's digital clock next. It read 11:47 p.m. I could have sworn it was closer to 11:40 when the flash happened. I thought maybe I'd misremembered, so I checked my phone. 11:45 p.m. The car clock was ahead of my phone by 2 minutes. It had never done that before. Both always matched. I'd synced them a week prior. I sat there staring at the phone, trying to piece it together. The dashcam timestamp jumped forward the same amount of time the dash clock had gained. My hands were shaking, but I didn't feel cold. The air inside the car felt heavy, like the pressure had shifted slightly. I turned the engine off and listened. Silence. No wind against the trees, no insects, no distant cars, only the faint ticking of the cooling engine. After maybe 30 seconds, the forest sound slowly returned. First, a soft rustle in the branches, then the faint crack of settling snow. I wasn't sure whether to drive on or call someone. Calling seemed ridiculous. What would I say? Instead, I got out of the car and walked to the edge of the turnout, looking over the water. Rimrock Lake was pitch black, smooth, barely reflecting the sky. The stars looked normal, bright, steady, nothing unusual. No lingering glow, no aircraft or satellites passing overhead, but something felt wrong, not fear exactly, more like disorientation, like my brain didn't fully trust what had just happened. I got back in the car and rewound the footage one more time, slowing it frame by frame. The flash frame was completely white, no artifacts, no edges of the windshield, no distortions, pure uniform white. I let the video continue a few more seconds. That's when I noticed something I hadn't before. Right after the flash frame and the first frame of darkness afterward, there was a faint blur along the tree line. A pale horizontal distortion near the top of the screen. It wasn't a shape, not even a light, just a thin ripple like heat haze. It lasted only one frame, then disappeared. I pulled the camera closer, squinting. In the next frame, everything was perfectly normal again. The more I stared, the worse I felt. Like I was making connections I shouldn't. Eventually, I turned the dash cam off completely. My hands didn't stop shaking until I gripped the steering wheel hard enough to make my knuckles hurt. When I pulled back onto the highway, the car clock still read 2 minutes ahead. I tried resetting it manually. It wouldn't change. The minute number blinked and returned to 11:52. My phone clock kept ticking normally, perfectly in sync with the network time. I drove slower than usual, every mile feeling stretched. A few times, the sky seemed a little lighter in my peripheral vision, the same way it does before dawn, but when I glanced up, it was pitch black again. Nothing moving, nothing shining, just the same endless mountain road. About 20 minutes later, somewhere near the Oak Creek turnoff, the car clock corrected itself. It didn't rewind, it didn't jump. It just flickered once and synced perfectly with my phone. I stared at the display so long I drifted slightly over the center line. By the time I reached town, the dash cam had powered itself back on without me touching it. I didn't notice until I pulled into my driveway. The screen was glowing faintly, cycling through its usual standby mode. I watched the time. It matched the car clock. When I reviewed the saved clips, the footage was intact up to the flash, and then skipped straight to the point after it. The dash cam had kept the timestamp jump, but didn't show the missing minutes. The white frame was still there, but everything in between was gone. In the morning, I checked again, hoping maybe sleep would make it look different or less strange. It didn't. The flash was still perfect white. The timestamp still jumped, and the single frame after it still had that faint ripple in the tree line that I couldn't explain no matter how long I stared at it. When I stepped outside to clear my head, the driveway felt normal. The sky was bright. The mountains looked ordinary. But every time I thought about the moment the road went white, my stomach tightened. The dash cam never glitched again. Neither did the car clock. But I stopped taking Highway 12 at night after that. Even if I couldn't explain what had happened, the memory of how silent the forest became during those missing minutes stayed sharp enough that I didn't want to give that stretch of road another chance. I saw the silhouette on a foggy evening in late October, the kind of damp North Carolina night where the air feels thick enough to drink. I'd just finished eating at my friend Evan's place and decided to walk the long way home through the trail behind our neighborhood. It wasn't a smart idea. Visibility was awful, and the fog was rolling in heavier by the minute, but the woods were usually peaceful at that hour. The trail wasn't totally dark. Streetlights from the nearby road cast these vague, hazy glows through the trees, and the fog made everything look soft-edged. Even the branches above me looked blurred, like they were underwater. I walked slowly, hands in my jacket pockets, listening to the way sound seemed to travel strangely, close but muffled. I was almost at the halfway point, near the small clearing where the trail forks, when I noticed the silence. Not total silence. My footsteps still crunched on the damp leaves, but the insects were quieter than usual. No crickets, no night birds, just the occasional drip of condensation falling from the pines. I turned off my phone's flashlight just to see how dark it really was. The fog swallowed everything past 20 feet. I stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. That's when I saw it, a dark shape above the tree line. Not a person, not an animal, not anything with recognizable features. Just a smooth, solid silhouette hanging in the air beyond the clearing. The fog made it hard to judge distance, but it looked large. big enough that it blocked out a chunk of the dim sky behind it. I blinked hard, expecting it to shift or break apart into clouds. It didn't. It stayed perfectly still. At first I thought it had to be some weird trick of the fog, maybe a cluster of tree branches blending together. But branches sway, and this thing didn't move at all. And it wasn't jagged, it was too clean, almost shaped, like someone had cut an oval into the sky and filled it with darkness. I took one careful step forward. The silhouette didn't react, but the air changed. Not colder, exactly, just denser, like the fog around me thickened in response. My ears felt slightly pressurized, the way they do when you enter a tunnel. I kept staring, trying to understand what I was looking at. It didn't glow. It didn't make sound. It didn't even cast a shadow on the fog. It was just suspended there, a smooth patch of solid darkness. Then, without warning, the silhouette shifted. Not moved, but changed shape subtly, like its edges were softening. For a moment, it looked almost like it was turning in place, though I couldn't see any features or angles, just gliding darkness. My phone buzzed in my pocket, loud in the quiet. I jerked, instinctively stepping back. When I pulled the phone out, the screen simply said, "No signal." I usually got perfect service on this trail. I held the phone up, waving it slightly, and that's when the silhouette seemed to respond. Its edges tightened again, sharpening into the same oval shape as before, like it had been startled into stillness. I wasn't sure whether to run or try to get a better look. Before I could choose, the fog began to shift. Not from wind, there wasn't any, but the fog around the silhouette began thinning, almost clearing in a circular pattern, like something was pushing it aside from inside that dark shape. My heartbeat picked up hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. The silhouette stayed solid while the fog peeled back around it. It was like revealing a cutout that shouldn't exist, a hole in the world. The area around it brightened slightly as the thinning fog let more streetlight glow through, making the dark shape even more distinct. Then, everything reversed. The fog rolled back in, fast. Thick tendrils of it closed around the silhouette, swallowing it whole. For a brief second, I could still see the edges, as if it lingered beneath the surface of the mist. And then it was gone. Just gone. The fog drifted normally again. No hole, no distortion, no shadow hanging in the air. The sky above the trees looked the same as always, blank gray with no stars visible. I realized my breathing had gotten uneven. My hands were trembling so badly, I almost dropped my phone. I switched the flashlight back on just to feel like I had control of something, and the beam of light cut through the fog in a narrow tunnel. I forced myself to walk toward the clearing. My steps were loud, too loud, on the wet leaves. When I reached the spot where the silhouette had hovered, I stopped. The fog there was no thicker or thinner than anywhere else. No residual warmth, no cold spot, no noise, but something felt off in the clearing. It wasn't visual or physical, just a sense, like the air had been rearranged and hadn't settled back properly. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds before the forest noises returned. First a cricket, then a second, farther off. Something rustled in the underbrush, probably a rabbit. Gradually, the woods returned to normal, like someone had flipped the sound back on. I tried my phone again. 5 bars. Full signal. The timestamp still read 9:47 p.m., the same time it had been before the silhouette vanished. I had no idea how long I'd been staring at the thing, but apparently not enough for the clock to change, which somehow made the whole experience feel even stranger. I started walking again, fast, but not running. Every time I heard a stick crack or leaves shift, I snapped my head toward the sound, expecting to see the silhouette again. I didn't. When I finally stepped off the trail and into the neighborhood lights, the tension in my body finally uncoiled. I felt shaky, almost dizzy, and I had to take a moment just to breathe. But the weirdest part came when I got home. My jacket smelled faintly like electricity. Not burnt, just that sharp metallic scent the air gets right before a storm. Except the sky had been completely still the whole night. I hung the jacket up and sat on the couch, replaying the moment the fog peeled back around the silhouette, the way it seemed to have edges, smooth ones, the way it responded when my phone buzzed. Around midnight, out of habit, I checked the weather radar. Clear skies, no fog on the map at all. But I had walked through it. Thick, heavy, impossible to see through fog. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I let my mind drift, I saw that dark shape suspended above the trees, silent, smooth, and absolutely in place, like it had been there long before I noticed it, and maybe long after it disappeared. I woke up with a metallic taste in my mouth so strong it felt like I'd been chewing on an aluminum foil. At the same time, the faint smell of ozone hung in the air, sharp, electric, out of place for a cold February morning in northern Idaho. I sat up slowly, trying to figure out if maybe my heater had shorted or something, but the house was quiet. No odd beeping, no burnt plastic smell, just that metallic bite on my tongue and the weirdly clean smell, like the moment after lightning strikes. I swung my legs out of bed and felt a chill that didn't belong. I kept my thermostat set to 68 overnight, but the room felt colder than that, almost like a window had been open for hours. I checked. Both were shut tight, locked the way I always left them. Even the curtains were exactly where I'd pulled them the night before. When I stepped into the living room, the air felt normal again. Warm enough. No ozone smell. I shrugged it off, grabbed a shirt, and walked to the kitchen to start coffee. That's when I noticed the sky. It was unbelievably clear. Not clear for winter, not the clouds burned off early. It looked like someone had wiped the atmosphere clean. The blue was too deep, too sharp around the edges. The trees behind my cabin stood out like they'd been inked onto the horizon. I could see mountains in the distance that I usually only noticed on perfect midsummer days. It didn't look real. I stepped out onto the porch in bare feet, wincing as the boards bit into my skin with cold. The air was crisp, but not painfully so. It smelled normal again, except for the faintest hint of something. Sterile, like a hospital hallway. I leaned against the railing, scanning the tree line for anything odd. The birds were quiet. Usually by 7 a.m. I heard at least a few chickadees or crows, even in winter, but the woods around me sat still and muted, like someone had turned the volume down. I told myself I was just noticing things because I'd woken up weird. Then I saw the patch in the snow. About 20 feet from my porch, near the edge of the yard, the snow looked disturbed. Not footprints, more like a shallow impression, a wide oval shape pressed into the surface. The frost on it had melted unevenly, leaving faint radiating streaks around the edges. My first thought was that a deer had bedded down there, but no deer I'd ever seen made a perfectly smooth depression like that. I stepped into my boots and walked toward it. Each step crunched loudly, too loudly, sound carried in the strange morning air. When I reached the impression, I crouched beside it. The snow inside was slightly wet, but not slushy. The texture was wrong, too compacted, as if pressed evenly by something broad and smooth. No hoof marks, no drag marks, no melted patch from a fallen tree limb. As I touched the snow, the metallic taste in my mouth intensified, like it reacted to being near whatever had made the impression. I pulled my hand away fast. That's also when I realized I didn't remember going to bed the night before. Not clearly, anyway. I remembered brushing my teeth, cleaning the kitchen, scrolling on my phone, and then nothing. No memory of turning off the lights or climbing into bed. Just a blank spot that felt too subtle to notice until I looked for it. I stood there in the cold, staring at the impression. The sky felt like it was staring back. I heard a soft clicking sound behind me, a single tick like metal cooling. I spun around, expecting to see my porch railing contracting or maybe an icicle dropping, but nothing had moved. The only sound in the woods was my own breathing. I went inside, suddenly needing noise. I flipped on the radio. It crackled with static, then smoothed out into the morning farm report. Normal. Completely normal. Too normal, almost. I checked my phone next. 3 missed calls, all from my neighbor Henry, who lived about a quarter mile down the road. The timestamps were 3:14 a.m., 3:19 a.m., and 3:27 a.m. I hadn't heard a single ring. My call log showed no record of the phone ever waking up. No notifications, no battery dip. Just 3 missed calls sitting there like orphaned reminders. I called him back immediately. He answered on the first ring, voice shaky. "Did you see anything last night?" he asked. My mouth went dry. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "I don't know. Something woke me up. My house lights flickered and I thought I heard, I don't know, wind, humming, something. I saw your place from the window and tried calling, but the line wouldn't connect." "My phone never rang," I said. "I figured." He took a shaky breath. "Forget it. Probably nothing." But it didn't sound like nothing. We hung up, and I checked the power in my cabin. The clocks on my appliances all blinked but showed matching times, 5:32 a.m., which didn't line up with the actual time. I hadn't lost power the night before, not that I'd noticed, so I had no idea why they'd reset. My bedside alarm clock, the one with battery backup, showed 5:32 too. Every device agreed on the same wrong time. I walked back to the porch and stared at the sky again. It remained perfectly clear, the kind of clarity that didn't feel natural in winter. As I watched, a faint shimmer appeared near the horizon. Not light, not movement, more like heat haze, except it was below freezing. The shimmer stretched upward for a moment, then thinned out and vanished. A gust of wind hit, cold and sudden, as if something massive had just moved out of the area and the pressure was evening out. The trees shuddered. Snow dust blew off the branches. The metallic taste faded with that gust. So did the ozone smell. After a few seconds, the birds finally started up. A single chirp at first, then a handful, then the usual forest chorus slowly returning. The world sounded real again. I stayed outside a while, watching the woods, half expecting to hear or see something else. But the sky remained still. The odd clarity softened as thin clouds drifted in from the west. By the time I finished my coffee, everything looked completely ordinary. Later that afternoon, Henry stopped by. He didn't say anything about the night until he was leaving. He stood on my porch, hand on the railing, eyes locked on the trees. "You ever wake up tasting metal?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer right away. He nodded like he already knew. "Yeah, me too." Before he walked home, he added, almost reluctantly, "The sky looked wrong this morning." I didn't ask him what he meant. I didn't have to, because the impression in the snow was still there. And no matter how long I stared at it, I couldn't convince myself it came from anything natural. That night, I couldn't fall asleep. Not because I was scared, but because I kept waiting. Waiting for the taste of metal to return, for the smell of ozone, for that unnatural silence that didn't belong in a winter forest. Nothing happened. But around 2 a.m., the wind shifted suddenly, just once, rattling the cabin windows. And for a split second, the sky outside looked clearer than it should have. Clearer than it was possible for a February night to be. I noticed the compass drifting about halfway up the Long Ridge Trail near Silverton. It was late September and colder than I expected for the afternoon. Thin mountain air, a little breeze slipping through the pines, that kind of quiet where even your footsteps feel too loud. I'd taken the day off work to clear my head, and the trail was empty, except for a few mule deer I'd seen earlier near the switchbacks. The sky was bright but hazy, the sun diffused behind high clouds that looked almost metallic. My plan was to reach the overlook before sunset, eat the sandwich I'd packed, and head back down before the temperature dropped. About 15 minutes after I passed the old mining markers, I stopped for water and pulled out my compass. I wasn't lost, I just liked checking it out of habit. The needle was drifting. Slowly, not shaking the way it does when you move. It was sliding, steady, and deliberate, as if pulled by something. I turned the compass in a circle, expecting it to correct itself. It didn't. The needle kept drifting until it pointed almost completely east, even though I was facing north. I tapped the plastic case. The needle didn't budge. I held the compass flat in my palm and stood perfectly still. The needle stayed locked in the wrong direction, like it had decided east was the only direction that mattered. A faint breeze moved the branches overhead, but nothing else responded to it. Not the birds, not the underbrush. The usual forest noises felt muted, swallowed by the thin air. I slipped the compass back into my pocket, telling myself it was probably damaged, though I'd used it just last month without issue. The weirdness stuck with me as I kept heading up the ridge. Each time I touched my pocket, I felt the compass resting there like a question I didn't want to answer. As I climbed higher, the light started to dim, not sunset dim, just dulled, like a veil had passed over the ridge. Shadows stretched at strange angles, even though the sun was still high enough to cast short ones. I reached a clearing where fallen logs formed a natural break in the tree line. The ground leveled briefly before the next descent, and the ridge above came into view, a dark silhouette against the hazy sky. That's when I saw the glow, a dim pulse of light just above the ridgeline. Not bright, not colorful, just a soft, muted glow that swelled once and faded. A few seconds later, it pulsed again. Same strength, same duration. Then nothing. I blinked several times, waiting to see if it would pulse a third time, but the ridge returned to its normal shape, dark and still. I stood there listening. The forest was too quiet again. No wind, no insects, no birds, just the faint ringing silence you notice when everything natural stops at once. For whatever reason, my first instinct was to check the compass again. I pulled it out slowly. The needle didn't drift this time. It didn't move at all. It stayed pointing east, rigid, frozen, as if fused in place. I turned in a slow circle, but the needle didn't respond. It remained locked, pointing toward a patch of trees to my right. Not the ridge, not the trail, just a cluster of pines and spruce that looked the same as everything else around them. I swallowed hard and slipped the compass back into my pocket again, feeling the weight of it like a stone. I didn't want to hike toward that direction, but the trail bent left anyway, away from the needle. Relief washed over me for a second, just a second, before I realized something else was wrong. The air felt heavier, not humid or thick, just weighted like the atmosphere itself was denser on my skin. Breathing wasn't harder, but it felt less natural, like the rhythm was off by half a second. I pushed forward up the trail, walking deliberately without letting myself speed up. The glow hadn't been bright enough to cast shadows, but it had been real enough that my brain kept replaying it. 2 pulses, identical, controlled. Nothing in nature did that. As I climbed higher, the trees thinned and the wind picked up again. Normal sounds returned, a distant woodpecker, branches creaking, a squirrel chattering somewhere down the slope. The heaviness eased, but the tension in my shoulders didn't. When I reached the overlook, I didn't sit down. I didn't take my sandwich out. I walked straight to the edge and stared across the valley to the ridge where I'd seen the glow. The area looked ordinary, just sharp rock faces, stubborn pines clinging to the slopes, shadows forming as the sun drifted lower. Nothing on the ridge moved. Nothing reflected light. Nothing glowed. I checked my phone for the time, 4:11 p.m., earlier than I thought. I tried to take a photo of the ridge, but my phone camera focused strangely, as if refusing to sharpen the image. The ridge blurred slightly, no matter how many times I tapped the screen. The rest of the valley came out crystal clear. Only that ridge stayed soft-focused. I lowered the phone and exhaled slowly. The air changed again. A slight shift in pressure, just enough to pop my ears. I blinked and looked up at the ridge. The haze thickened for a moment, obscuring the tree line. The world felt quieter again. I reached into my pocket, fingers trembling a little, and pulled out the compass. The needle was pointing directly at the ridge now, not east, not any direction that made sense. It trembled once, like reacting to something invisible. Then it locked in place again. I don't know how long I stood there staring at it, maybe a minute, maybe 10. The ridge didn't shimmer again, no pulses of light returned. The haze thinned, revealing nothing unusual. But the compass wouldn't move, no matter how I tilted it, no matter how I turned my body. It stayed fused in that one direction. Eventually, the cold started seeping through my jacket and made me turn back toward the trail. Nervous energy had burned through me and left me tired enough that I didn't want to linger up there. The sun was dropping faster than I realized, and the shadows were already reaching across the valley. Halfway down the ridge, I heard something that made me stop in my tracks. A distant thump, not like falling rock, not like a branch snapping, more like pressure being released. A contained, muted sound that didn't echo. It came from the ridge. I didn't wait for a second one. I kept walking, not running, but faster than before, scanning the ground to keep the trail under my boots. The forest didn't go silent again, but the sounds felt uneven, patchy, like pockets of quiet were mixed with normal noise. By the time I reached the trailhead, the compass needle still hadn't corrected itself. It pointed uselessly toward the ridge, even as I walked away, even when I got into my car, even when I drove miles from the trail. I tossed it onto the passenger seat. It rattled softly, but the needle didn't budge. Back home, after a hot shower and a long stare at the wall, I checked the compass one more time. The needle pointed north, perfectly, as if it had never malfunctioned at all. I set it on the kitchen table and stepped back, watching for any drift. It stayed steady. Everything looked normal again. But when I closed my eyes, I could still see the ridge, still feel that impossible heaviness in the air, still picture the dim glow pulsing twice in exactly the same way. And even though the compass looked fine now, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there had turned it, deliberately, toward itself. The porch light started flickering around 11:20 p.m. I noticed it while I was washing dishes, because the rhythm of it kept catching my eye through the window. On for 2 seconds, off for 1. Perfect intervals. So perfect that at first I thought it had to be something wrong with the wiring or the bulb. But the rhythm didn't change at all, not even when the heater kicked on. I dried my hands and stepped onto the porch to get a better look. The night was calm, cold, still, a quiet suburban street in the middle of a Tuesday. No wind, no cars. The kind of night where the air feels thinner, like everything is holding its breath. I looked up at the bulb, expecting it to be loose or buzzing. But it wasn't flickering the way bulbs usually do. There was no sputter, no hum, no shift in brightness. It was just switching on and off like someone was flipping a switch on a timer. 2 seconds on, 1 second off, over and over. I reached up to touch the base of the fixture to see if it was overheating, but right when my fingers were an inch away, the light turned off again. The timing startled me, even though I knew exactly when it would happen. I lowered my hand and looked down the street. That's when I saw the glow. A soft white glow at the far end of the block, barely above the pavement. Not bright, not like headlights approaching. It didn't spread across the ground or cast any shadows. It was just sitting there, hovering low, round at the edges like a lantern behind a sheet of fog. Except there was no fog. I blinked a couple of times, thinking maybe it was someone's porch light reflecting weirdly, but none of the houses down there had anything that matched it. And the glow wasn't steady. It had its own faint pulse, like a slow breath. It brightened for half a second, then dimmed back down. My porch light kept its perfect rhythm behind me. 2 seconds on, 1 second off. The glow at the end of the street pulsed again, slightly out of sync, like the two lights were aware of each other but not coordinating. I stepped off the porch and onto the walkway. The air felt colder than it should have for late March, cold enough that I could see my breath, even though I hadn't earlier. The neighborhood looked normal. Trash cans lined up for morning pickup, a lone bicycle leaning against a fence, the street lamp at the intersection flickering the way it always did in spring. But the white glow wasn't normal. I walked a few feet down the driveway, hands shoved into my sweatshirt pockets. I kept expecting the glow to fade away like a trick of the eyes, but it stayed exactly where it was, hovering at what looked like shoulder height. 2 houses down, the Perkins dog started barking. One loud bark, then another, then silence. That dog usually barked non-stop at every squirrel, so the sudden quiet felt strange. My porch light clicked off again, right on time. I glanced back and realized something else. The other porch lights on my street weren't flickering. Just mine. I didn't know why that bothered me so much, but it did. I walked to the curb and stopped. The glow didn't move closer or farther. It hovered like it was anchored to that spot, at the bend in the street where the road sloped slightly downward. I tried pulling out my phone to take a picture, but the screen stayed black even though I knew the battery was around 60%. I pressed the side button a few times. Nothing. No response at all. The glow pulsed again. Not brighter, just more defined for a moment, as if the edges sharpened before softening again. I looked back up at my porch light. For the first time since I stepped out, it didn't turn back on. It stayed dark, even though it should have flicked on a second earlier. I waited. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. Still off. The timing had finally broken. I looked down the street again. The glow brightened slightly, only a little, but enough that I saw the faint outline of the houses near it. The light seemed to curve around them, not lighting them up, just bending. A car passed on the avenue behind the neighborhood, and for a second, a faint rumble carried across the houses. When it faded, the quiet afterward felt heavier. I should have gone back inside. I knew that, but something made me stay. Not curiosity exactly, more like a sense that moving would make something worse. While I stood there, hands in my pockets, the glow shifted upward maybe a foot, then stopped. It didn't bob like something floating. It rose smoothly, intentionally. My porch light came back on behind me. I jerked at the sudden brightness, even though I'd been expecting it. When I turned back toward the street, the glow had moved. Only a little, maybe a few inches, but enough that I could tell it wasn't tied to the ground. It wasn't a reflection or a yard light. It was drifting, not toward me, not away, just drifting in a tiny arc as if searching for balance. My stomach twisted hard. I took a step backward toward the driveway. The glow paused in its drift. Just paused. I held still. The glow dimmed, almost disappearing entirely. For a moment, I thought it had finally burned out or faded like it should have. Then it pulsed again, brighter this time. My porch light flickered twice in rapid succession, breaking its rhythm again. A soft crackling sound reached me on the cold air. Not loud, not electrical, more like static from an old radio far away. It lasted maybe 2 seconds before fading. When the static stopped, the glow at the end of the street shrank. Not disappeared, shrunk like someone was turning down a dial on its size instead of its brightness. The edges tightened, the shape became smaller and more compact until it looked no bigger than a fist. Then the glow dropped, just a few feet, down toward the pavement. And then it vanished, not blinked, not dissolved. It was there 1 second and gone the next, like someone flipped a switch. My porch light stopped flickering entirely and stayed on. The dog down the street barked again, twice. A breeze swept through the neighborhood, carrying the first normal sound I'd heard all night, dry leaves skittering across a driveway. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and backed up toward my porch. My phone finally lit up again as I reached the top step. The time had jumped ahead by 7 minutes. Inside, all the appliances were on and nothing seemed out of place. But when I locked the door and turned around, the house felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Too still, too empty. I went back to the window once before bed. The street was dark and quiet. No glow, no flickering light, just the familiar shape of the neighborhood. But the next morning when I walked out to get the mail, I noticed something on the pavement at the end of the street. A faint scorch mark, circular and smooth, right where the glow had hovered. I was sitting in my car on County Road 7, pulled over at one of those little gravel turnouts that barely fit a single vehicle. It was close to midnight, cold enough that the windshield kept fogging unless I cracked a window. I'd stopped there because I needed a break from driving. My eyes were getting tired, and the stretch between Layton and Ridgebrook was one long tunnel of darkness with no other cars, no houses, nothing but pine forest and frozen ditches. I killed the engine but kept the battery on so I could listen to the heater fan winding down. The interior lights faded, and the car settled into that quiet hum it makes when everything is powered, but nothing's running. I leaned back, rubbed my face, and tried to decide if I should nap for 20 minutes or power through the last hour home. That's when I felt the vibration. Subtle at first. Just a soft tremor through the steering wheel, almost like the engine was still running even though it wasn't. I rested my palm on the wheel to make sure it wasn't my imagination. The vibration continued, steady and faint, like a pulse traveling up through the frame of the car. I checked the dashboard, everything dark except the clock. The keys were in my lap. The car wasn't on. The vibration got slightly stronger, enough that I pressed my other hand to the wheel too, trying to pinpoint if it was coming from the column or the frame. It reminded me of a distant generator humming underground, or when a heavy truck passes a few streets over, only there were no trucks out here. No pavement past this turnout, just forest, road, and night. I opened the door slowly and stepped out, expecting the vibration to stop once I wasn't touching the car. But when I placed my hand on the roof, I felt it there too. Faint, rhythmic. The woods around me were quiet. Too quiet for winter, when you can usually hear branches popping from temperature shifts. Even the wind had gone still. I listened hard, but there was nothing except my own breathing. I circled to the back of the car to check the trunk, thinking maybe something inside had shifted or was rolling around, though that didn't make sense with the vibration. I was halfway there when a glow caught my eye, a faint light above the road behind me. Not bright like headlights, not high like a street lamp, more like a low fog light suspended 20 or 30 feet above the asphalt. Pale, almost white, but softened around the edges. It didn't cast much illumination, but it was distinct enough that I could see the outline of the road behind it and the tops of the trees. I froze the moment I saw it. The glow didn't move. It just hung there, almost perfectly still. hovering over the empty road where no car had passed for at least an hour. The vibration in the car pulsed slightly stronger. I backed up until I was leaning against the bumper, trying to decide if the light was some kind of reflection. But there were no houses around, no billboards, nothing shiny enough to bounce light. There wasn't even a moon. Clouds had rolled in around sunset and never cleared. I reached for my phone, but when I tapped the screen, it didn't respond. It lit up, then froze on the lock screen. The time showed 11:58 p.m., but the seconds didn't tick forward. The light above the road pulsed once, barely noticeable, just a slight swell of brightness, and the vibration under my palm deepened like something resonated through the metal of the car. I swallowed and took a slow step toward the turnout entrance, trying to get a clearer view. The glow shifted, not to the side, downward, maybe a foot or two. The movement was smooth, controlled, like it wasn't drifting, but adjusting itself. I thought for a second that it might be a drone, but drones make noise, especially in cold air when the blades bite harder. This made no sound at all. I crouched slightly without meaning to, bracing a hand on my knee. The air felt heavier near the turnout, not warmer or colder, just pressurized in some subtle way that made me breathe differently. The light hovered there another few seconds. Then it began to fade, not flicker. Fade, like someone was dimming a bulb slowly. As it dimmed, the vibration in the car started easing too. I kept my eyes locked on the glow even as it dwindled to a soft ember, then to a barely there outline, and finally nothing but darkness and road. The instant it disappeared, the woods seemed to exhale. A breeze pushed through the trees, and a few branches cracked in the cold. My phone unfroze and buzzed with a delayed notification. The vibration in the car stopped completely, leaving the steering wheel dead still under my hand. I stood there several moments longer, staring at the empty space where the light had been. The road was pitch black again, the kind of dark where distance stops making sense. After a while, I forced myself back into the driver's seat. I shut the door quietly, as if noise might bring the light back. My hands were shaking a little as I started the engine, listening for any leftover hum. Nothing. The car sounded normal. The radio static was normal. Even the heater felt normal, blowing against my legs. I checked the rearview mirror before pulling out. There was nothing behind me but the faint outline of the road and the tree silhouettes on either side. No glow, no movement, just regular winter darkness. I drove slowly for the first mile, checking the mirror every few seconds. Every time I looked, the road stayed empty, but the sense that something had been there, right above that strip of pavement, stuck with me like a weight between my shoulders. When I finally hit the junction where the road met Highway 13, I pulled over again and stepped out, telling myself I needed fresh air before driving the rest of the way home. The air was normal here. Just cold, clean night air. No vibration. No glow. But when I touched the hood of my car, it felt unusually warm for how long the engine had been off earlier. Not hot, not concerning, just warmer than made sense. The drive home after that felt longer than usual. At every bend in the road, I expected to see that faint white glow behind me or ahead of me, just floating above the asphalt. It never appeared again. Inside my driveway, I shut off the engine and sat in silence for a few minutes, hands still gripping the wheel. No vibration, no light, nothing strange. But I didn't take that road for a while after that. And even now, whenever I'm parked at night, engine off, world quiet, I can't help pressing my palm lightly to the steering wheel, waiting to feel that subtle hum return from somewhere I can't quite explain. I saw the vertical sunrise while staying at my uncle's cabin outside Ophir, Colorado. I'd gone up there in early May to help him clear brush and repair some siding before tourist season picked up. The cabin sat in a narrow valley, surrounded by tall pines and rock faces that made the mornings slow to brighten. Usually the first hint of daylight was a glow behind the eastern ridge, creeping across the treetops like someone lifting a dimmer switch. But that morning, it didn't happen like that. I'd woken up a little before 5, not because I set an alarm, but because something felt off. The air inside the cabin was unusually still, like the temperature had stalled mid-change. The heater wasn't running, the refrigerator wasn't humming, yet the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt expectant. I got dressed quietly and stepped onto the porch. The boards were cold under my socks, the kind of cold that sticks through the wood even in late spring. I leaned against the railing and looked toward the ridge, trying to gauge whether the sun was close. The sky was still dark, not pitch black, just a deep, unbroken slate color. No birds yet, no rustling from the woods. Even the creek at the bottom of the hill seemed quieter than usual, as if something were muffling the sound. That's when the light appeared, not across the horizon the way a sunrise should. It came in a narrow vertical line, thin at first, like a seam in the sky cracking open. It glowed white, not orange or pink, and it stretched straight upward, maybe 50 or 60 degrees above the ridgeline. At first, I thought it was a distant spotlight or something bouncing off clouds, but there weren't any clouds above the ridge. The sky was clear, and the line wasn't spreading. It wasn't brightening the area around it. It was contained, a narrow column of light where no structure or trail should have been. I stepped off the porch and walked into the yard to get a clearer view. The air felt colder there, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. My breath fogged in front of me, even though it shouldn't have at that temperature. The vertical light widened slightly, not sideways, but in intensity. Its edges sharpened. It wasn't flickering or wavering like something reflecting. It was solid, as if the sky itself had become backlit in one very specific spot. I checked the ridge, wondering if maybe there was a new cell tower or something I hadn't noticed. But the tree line looked the same as always. Dense pines, a couple patches of exposed rock, nothing that could produce light like this. Then the birds started, not all at once. A single chirp from one side of the yard, then another from somewhere deeper in the forest. But instead of building naturally like sunrise activity, the sounds came in staggered, uneven bursts, as if the animals were confused about whether morning had begun. The light grew a shade brighter, still vertical, still narrow, still wrong. I felt an odd pressure in my ears, like descending in a plane. I swallowed, expecting it to clear, but it didn't. The pressure stayed, subtle but constant. I reached into my pocket for my phone and tried taking a picture, but the screen stayed black for a few seconds longer than usual before finally turning on. Even then, the camera app froze, only loading after a long delay. When it did, the lens refused to focus on the light. It registered everything else, the trees, the ridge, the dark sky, but the vertical glow showed up as a blur, a smeared streak like the sensor didn't know how to process it. I tried taking a video. The phone buzzed once and kicked me back to the home screen. Behind the phone, the light changed again. It began retracting, not dimming, retracting upward. The bottom of the column, the part closest to the ridge, started pulling in on itself, as if someone grabbed the base of a curtain and lifted it. The glow thinned downward and concentrated upward, sliding into itself without fading. My stomach dropped as I watched. There was something unsettling about seeing light behave like fabric. The retraction continued slowly, smoothing upward until the entire column was half as tall as before. Then a faint shimmer appeared at the top edge, just a tiny ripple in the air, like heat rising from asphalt, even though the morning was too cold for that. The birds went silent again. Every one of them. The creek noise dulled even more. The pressure in my ears intensified for a few seconds, enough that it made me wince. And then the vertical line of light compressed into a thin sliver, so thin I thought it might disappear entirely. It paused there, held. A perfect needle-thin line in the sky, glowing white against the pre-dawn darkness. Then it snapped upward and vanished. No sound, no flash, just gone. The sky looked normal again, dark, calm, empty. But the valley didn't bounce back the way it should have after sunrise activity. The birds didn't resume right away. The creek didn't get louder. The air stayed heavy for another minute or so while I stood there frozen, gripping the railing. Finally, the pressure in my ears released. A wave of normal morning noises returned. First a jay screaming in the distance, then the creek, then the wind brushing through the tops of the pines. The world regained its texture, but the horizon was still dark. The real sunrise wouldn't happen for another 20 minutes. I checked my phone again, 5:12 a.m. The time felt wrong somehow, like it should have advanced more than it had. But I had no way of proving that. I stayed on the porch until the actual sunrise began, spreading across the ridge the way it always did. Slow, warm, predictable. Nothing strange appeared in the sky. Nothing moved differently. The world looked exactly the way it should have looked the entire time. Around 7, I walked down the hill toward the creek to check the brush we were clearing. The ground looked normal. The rocks looked normal. But the air right by the water felt slightly warmer, like it held leftover heat from something that shouldn't have been there. When I stood still, I caught the faint smell of ozone, barely noticeable, gone in seconds. I didn't tell my uncle about what I saw. He's the kind of guy who'd chalk it up to sleep deprivation or reflections off early traffic, even though no roads face that ridge. But late that night, after he'd gone to bed, I stepped outside again, half expecting the sky to do something strange. It didn't. The stars were ordinary. The air was ordinary. Everything was ordinary. Still, I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thin vertical line, bright, silent, and absolutely impossible, pulling itself up into the sky like it had someplace else to be. It was around 10:30 on a Thursday night, early October. I just finished cleaning up dinner and remembered the trash had to go out. Collection was Friday morning. I was barefoot, wearing just a hoodie and old sweatpants, walking the can down the side of the house to the curb. It had been a quiet night. No wind, just that cold stillness that settles in when the temperature drops quick after dark. We live in a cul-de-sac outside of Medford, Oregon. Suburban, but on the edge of a more rural patch. A few houses, big yards, and nothing but woods behind our fence line. I got to the curb and popped the lid shut on the can when I noticed a soft light to my left, like someone had flicked on a porch lamp across the way. But it wasn't a lamp. Across the street, just above the Wilkinson's house, maybe 20-25 feet above their roofline, there was a pale bluish-white light, oval-shaped, not blinking, not swaying, just hanging there. The Wilkinsons were out of town that week, so I knew it wasn't them messing with anything. My first thought was drone, but it didn't move like a drone. No tilt, no hum, completely still. And it wasn't that sharp LED white most drones have. This was softer, almost foggy, like light shining through frosted glass. I stood there watching it for maybe 10 seconds, and I don't remember hearing a thing. No bugs, no breeze, no distant traffic, just silence. I looked down the street. No other lights, no other people. Just the yellow porch glow from a few houses and that pale thing over the roof. Then it dimmed, not all at once. It faded like someone turning down a dimmer switch slowly. When it got to the point I could barely see it, it didn't fly off or move. It just vanished, like it blinked out. I stood there for a full minute, staring at the spot. Nothing, no sound, no movement, just the same quiet street I've lived on for 12 years. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. Didn't say anything to my wife, Erin. She was already half asleep on the couch. The next morning, I walked across the street before work, just to see. There was nothing on the Wilkinsons' lawn or roof. No signs of anyone having been there. No scorched patches, no tire tracks, nothing out of place. I tried to forget about it. Figured maybe I saw a reflection. Maybe someone behind me opened a window and it caught some light weird. But that night, around the same time, I was in the kitchen finishing dishes when the motion light in our backyard clicked on. I glanced out the window, thinking maybe a raccoon or one of the stray cats from down the hill. There was nothing, just the yard. Still, dimly lit, leaves shifting in the breeze. But the light stayed on longer than it should have. Usually it turns off after 30 seconds, but this time it lasted a full minute before shutting off. I didn't go outside. The third night, Saturday, is when things got harder to explain. Around 10:45, I stepped out to grab a hoodie from the car. It had rained earlier and the air was damp. I didn't notice anything at first, but as I walked up the driveway, I felt something shift, like pressure in my ears, almost like when you're gaining altitude in a plane. A soft, muffled pop, then that thick quiet again, like sound was being soaked up by something. I turned around and looked across the street. Nothing above the Wilkinsons this time, but farther off, past the end of the cul-de-sac, above the tree line, I saw movement. Something dark shifted against the sky. It wasn't lit, and it wasn't shaped like a plane or bird. It was wide and slow and wrong. I froze. Tried to trace it, but it blended into the sky so well I could only track it by what stars it blocked out. Just like a smear in the air. No lights, no sound. It floated past, maybe 200 or 300 feet up, heading east over the trees, and then I couldn't see it anymore. I stood there, hand on the driver's side door, until a car came down the street, headlights snapping me out of it. When they passed, everything felt normal again. Ears unpopped, night sounds returned, motion light didn't go off, nothing dramatic, but I couldn't shake the feeling something had just been here, watching. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Woke up at 3:17 a.m. on the dot. No sound, no dream, just wide awake. I lay there for a while, trying not to look at the window, not really sure why. The next morning, I checked the cameras. We have two. One doorbell cam, one mounted over the garage. Both record motion-triggered clips to a cloud account. I scanned through the feed from 10 p.m. to midnight the night before. There was nothing. Literally nothing. No clips, just a gap. It jumped from 9:53 p.m. to 12:12 a.m., like the system just didn't detect anything, which was weird because it should have picked up me going to the car or that passing vehicle. It always does. I checked the camera settings, all normal. Wi-Fi was solid, timestamp accurate. I even walked out to test it. The second I stepped into the frame, it recorded me just fine. I told Erin about all of it that evening. Not the first night, but the past two. The silence, the thing over the trees, the camera weirdness. She kind of brushed it off, said maybe I was overtired, maybe the software glitched, so I didn't press it. But I kept paying attention. A week went by with nothing. No lights, no motion triggers, no waking up at 3 a.m. Then on a Wednesday, I came home from work and something was off the second I walked in. The kitchen clock was flashing 12. Microwave too. We hadn't lost power, nothing else was blinking. My laptop was still logged in, Erin's phone still charged. I asked her if she noticed the clocks. She just frowned and said no, said they were normal when she left for work at 7:30. So sometime between 7:30 and 6 p.m., only the kitchen clocks reset and nothing else. That night I took the trash out again around 10:20. Sky was overcast, no stars. I stood in the driveway a little longer than usual, just watching. And there it was again. This time farther back, above the trees behind the Wilkinsons' property. Same pale, hazy light, hovering, not moving, no beam, just there. I didn't go any closer. I didn't look away. I just stood there, breathing slow, staring at it for what felt like a full minute. Then it dimmed, same as before, slow, soft, until it was gone. The second it vanished, my porch light flickered once, just a quick blink, then back to normal. I turned and went inside. I didn't check the cameras, didn't want to know if they saw it or not. I just made sure the door was locked, drew the blinds, and went to bed. I was living out near Blanchard, Oklahoma at the time, middle of nowhere, really. I didn't drive back then, so I used the rural transit service to get into Norman for work. They had this little flag stop set up about half a mile down the gravel road from my rental, near an old cattle gate. Basically just a wooden bench under a warped aluminum shelter. No lights, no signs, no schedule posted. You had to call the day before to reserve your pickup, and the buses would roll through sometime within a 10-minute window. That morning, I'd gotten up at 4:30 to make the 5:15 pickup. It was late October, and the sun didn't rise until close to 7. Still fully dark out when I left the house. I remember how quiet it was, the kind of deep, early silence where sound carries farther. The air was cold, maybe low 40s, with a little fog gathering in the low parts of the field near the road. I walked with a flashlight. Not that it did much, just enough to keep from rolling an ankle on a rut or hitting a ditch. When I reached the stop, I clicked the light off and sat on the bench. Nothing but open pasture across the road, trees on either side, maybe 70 yards deep, and the sky above just starting to pale from black to a deep gray blue. The weird part started small. First thing I noticed was the bugs, or the lack of them. It happened suddenly, like flipping a switch. 1 second there were crickets chirping from every direction, and the next it was just gone. No fade out. Just silence. I sat up straight, instantly alert. I've lived out here long enough to know when the bugs go quiet, something's up. Coyote, bobcat, maybe a person, something moving around. I turned the flashlight back on and panned the trees, but didn't see anything. No rustle, no movement. Then I saw the light. It was behind the tree line across the road, off to my right, maybe 100 yards out. At first I thought it might be a truck. It was that kind of pale white yellow, low to the ground, not blinking. But it was too soft to be headlights. more like the glow from a lantern if a lantern could light up half an acre at once. It rose slowly. Not fast, but not natural either. It didn't flicker, didn't shift, just steadily lifted above the tree line, a perfectly round, diffuse glow. I couldn't see what was making it. No structure, had no shape, just light. And it made no sound. That was maybe the worst part. You expect something moving to make noise, a drone buzz, wind, anything. But this thing came up like it was underwater, smooth and completely silent. My breath started fogging up, and for a second I felt lightheaded. I realized I'd been holding my breath without noticing. I stood up, gripping my flashlight like it would do anything, and took a few steps back from the bench. Then everything turned a weird kind of silver. Not bright, not like daylight, but the fog and grass and even the bench had this dull, metallic sheen. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Then the light dimmed a little, not off, but like someone put a filter over it. I heard a soft click sound, way up high. Not loud, just a single dry snap in the sky, and the light drifted sideways behind the trees again. The bugs didn't come back. The air felt flat. My ears started ringing. Not loud, just this soft, constant whine. At 5:19, the bus pulled up. I heard it before I saw it, the rumble of diesel down the road. The headlights swept across me and I waved, probably too eagerly. The driver, same guy as usual, named Kyle, opened the door, gave me this squinty look like he was confused. I climbed up the steps and scanned my card like normal. He didn't say anything until I sat down in the second row. "You just now get here?" he asked, still looking at me in the rear view. I shook my head. "No, been waiting since 5. Maybe a little before." He frowned. "I pulled in just now, real slow, had my high beams on. Didn't see anyone till you waved." I shrugged, was standing right at the bench. He didn't push it, just gave a little huh and pulled back onto the road. I watched the tree line disappear behind us as we drove. Later that morning, when I got off work, I checked the transit app to see what time the bus had logged its stop. There was no record of a pickup at my location, just said no rider found. I asked Kyle the next day if the GPS was messed up or something. He said no, said it showed him stopping there, but said he'd marked it as a no-show when he got close because he didn't see me, and then had to undo it when I climbed aboard. I didn't mention the light. Not to him, not to anyone. But I still think about that moment, standing alone in the dark, the sound of the crickets gone, the sky silver for no reason, and that soft snap in the air like a wire being cut. It felt like something paused me or passed through me. I still ride that bus sometimes, but I don't wait alone in the dark anymore. I woke up in the middle of the night like I often do, but this was different. It wasn't that groggy half-dream wake where you can't tell if you actually opened your eyes. This was sharp, sudden awareness. I sat up, glanced at the clock on my nightstand, 3:07 a.m. I rubbed my eyes and reached out for my glasses, and that's when I noticed the front door. It was wide open. I mean, fully open, the deadbolt sticking out like someone had pulled it without turning it back. Wind swaying the curtain over the side window. I'd locked that door before bed, always did. I'm the kind of person who double-checks locks, deadbolts, even windows before I go to sleep. There was no rational explanation for it being open. My first thought was, someone's broken in, but the house was silent, apart from the faint hum of the fridge and the house fan in the living room. No footsteps, no creaks from the floorboards, nothing. Just that wide gaping front door framing the dark yard beyond. I eased out of bed in bare feet and stood there for a moment, heart thudding, trying to digest what I was seeing. I shut the bedroom door quietly behind me, standard habit, not thinking about it, and walked toward the living room. My feet hit the hardwood, and I remember thinking how normal it all felt, like I was missing something obvious. I flicked on the hallway light. That's when I noticed the mud, caked on the soles of my feet, dark brown, dried in patches like it had been walked through thick, wet dirt. I looked down at my feet, confused. I hadn't been outside, not that day, not that evening. I remember brushing my teeth, setting the coffee maker for the morning, locking up before crawling into bed. No steps outside after that. I took a slow breath and forced my eyes up to scan the room. Nothing was out of place. Couch cushions lined up, coffee mugs on the counter where I left them, keys on the hook. No sign of disturbance. But the front door was still open, and my feet were muddy. I didn't want to check the security footage, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to uncover something I couldn't rationalize. But I stepped into the kitchen anyway and pulled up the security app on my phone. There was a power drop in the middle of the night. The system logged it at 2:52 a.m. A brief dip in power, like a breaker flipped momentarily or a utility fluctuation. The cameras had restarted right after that, but the footage from 2:51 a.m. to 2:55 a.m. was just a frozen frame. A still image of my porch light glowing in the night, no motion recorded, no timestamps moving, just static. I swiped around the app, pulled up the clips from before and after. Everything else looked normal. Cats prowling the backyard at 11 p.m., dawn light rising over the street at 6:15 a.m., cars passing by the driveway. But that 4-minute gap was just gone. I locked eyes with the open front door in the live view, then panned to the back. The backyard cam showed nothing unusual. Snow was melting in patches, no footprints at all, nothing moving. I closed the app and put my phone in my pocket. Still feeling like I was piecing together a dream I'd already forgotten. I walked the few steps to the front door, my socks forgotten at the foot of the stairs, still barefoot and muddy. The mud pattern was odd, smeared in a way that didn't look like someone had walked forward or turned around. It looked like someone had stepped down and then back up again, like a hesitation, a pause in motion. Outside the door, the porch light was flickering slightly, like the bulb was old or the socket was loose. I glanced down at the doormat. No footprints heading into the yard, just clean pavement. I leaned out, hands on the doorframe. The street was empty. No cars, no voices. A single streetlight across the road cast an orange glow on the sidewalk. Nothing stirred. I closed the door behind me carefully and dead-bolted it. That felt automatic, muscle memory more than thought. I stood there a second, listening to the click of the lock slide home. I took off my socks and set them by the laundry basket, mud side up. I padded back into the kitchen to get a glass of water. My eyes kept flicking to the clock. 3:15 a.m. I couldn't go back to sleep, not after an experience that didn't make sense. So I pulled up the security clips again, trying to watch the moments before the freeze, trying to see something I might have missed. A flicker of light, a shadow at the edge of frame, a blur in the corner. But the frames were clean, steady, normal. Birds on the wires outside at 1:30 a.m., nothing walking up the porch steps, just the usual calm night. I sat there with the coffee pot warming up, waiting for dawn, watching the live feed, wondering about that gap exactly at 2:52 a.m. I noticed a few other odd things in the footage, little anomalies I didn't register before. Twice, a swatch of yard looked like it glowed faintly for less than a second. Once, the timestamp jumped by a frame but showed the same visual content, like it had been duplicated. I chalked it up to glitching software at first, but as the minutes ticked past, I felt that same emptiness I'd felt standing at the open door, like something had interrupted my night, and I had walked through it without knowing. I cleaned up the mud from my feet with a damp towel and laid out a pair of slippers beside my bed. The socks went straight in the wash. I kept checking the clock, waiting for the next strange moment. But after the sun rose, the street waking up, neighbors leaving for work, the ordinary noise of life, nothing more happened. I got in my car later to run errands. The snow was still melting in the yard, no footprints out front, no sign of anything. I stood at the edge of the driveway, the morning sun on my neck, and looked at the house the way you do when something doesn't add up, like maybe if I stared long enough, I'd see what I missed. But there was just the house and the melting snow and the bright, quiet morning. And the memory of waking up at 3 a.m. with the front door wide open and muddy feet I couldn't explain. Image: I was driving back from my sister's place in Bluefield, heading east on Route 20, cutting through that stretch near Pipestem where the road winds along the ridgeline. It was around 11:30 at night, early October, and the fog had rolled in fast after sunset. The kind of thick, damp fog that clings to the trees and headlights don't do much good in. I'd been taking it slow, maybe 35 tops, just trying to stay in my lane and not end up in a ditch. There was no one else on the road. No traffic, no porch lights from houses, just fog and darkness. I had the windows cracked a little for air, and the silence outside was total. No crickets, no wind, just the low hum of the engine. Right as I passed a pull-off spot, I think it's technically a scenic overlook, but you couldn't see a thing, I caught movement above the tree line. Off to my left, on the opposite side of the valley, were three soft white lights drifting slowly above the trees. At first I thought it might be a plane banking low, but they were way too steady, and there was no blinking, no red or green. They moved together in a straight line, not fast, not jerky. Just a smooth, slow glide parallel to the ridge. I pulled over, not all the way off the road, just enough to get my wheels out of the lane. I rolled the window all the way down and leaned toward the passenger side, trying to get a better view. The lights were maybe 200 yards away, but high up, maybe 50 feet above the treetops. Not illuminating anything, not making the fog glow, just quietly sliding along. Then they stopped. Dead still. Hung there, completely motionless. Then the fog thickened again. Not gradually, it was like someone poured smoke across the road. In a matter of seconds, I couldn't see more than 10 feet out the window. And when it cleared, no lights. They didn't rise, didn't streak away, just gone. No sound, no movement, nothing. I sat there for a good minute or two, waiting to see if they'd reappear. Nothing did. I started driving again, slower than before. I felt weird, like I shouldn't have stopped. Not panicked, exactly, just watched. About 2 miles later, I realized something strange. My dashboard clock read 12:07. That stretch doesn't take half an hour. It had felt like maybe 5 minutes passed since I saw the lights. 10, tops. I hadn't turned off the engine, hadn't checked my phone. I hadn't done anything but sit there for maybe a minute or two, but 30 minutes had gone by. I thought maybe the clock was off, but my phone said the same thing. I even double-checked against the clock on the radio when I got home. Everything matched. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed another odd thing. My car radio had reset. All the presets were gone, like the battery had been disconnected. Clock stayed correct, but the rest was wiped. My check engine light was on too for the first time since I bought the car. That night, after I went to bed, I had this strange vibration in my ears. Not a sound, exactly. Just pressure. Like being on a plane that never levels out. It lasted for a few days. The next morning, I checked local news and social media, just looking to see if anyone else had seen something weird. Drones, aircraft testing, anything. Nothing came up. I drove that same stretch again a few days later during the daytime. I tried to find that exact pull-off, and I think I did, but standing there in daylight, everything felt smaller than I remembered. Trees weren't as tall as they'd seemed that night. The slope across the valley looked farther away, but that same stillness was there, the same quiet. I haven't seen the lights again. Not there, not anywhere. But sometimes when fog rolls in, especially if I'm driving alone, I'll catch myself looking toward the trees again, waiting, half expecting them to come back. They haven't, but I still don't know what it was I saw, or why I felt like something was watching me from above that night. I was stargazing behind my cousin Jonah's cabin the night it happened. He lived out in the hills near Pinedale, Wyoming, where the sky actually looked the way it does in planetarium posters. Huge, sharp, crowded with stars you never see in town. He'd invited a few of us up for the weekend because the Perseid meteor shower was supposed to peak, and he wanted company. I drove up late after work, figuring I'd miss most of the show, but still get a quiet night out of it. By the time I got there, it was close to 11. Jonah and his girlfriend Ariana were already out in the field with blankets and a little speaker playing something low and calm. The weather was clearer than the forecast said it would be, cold but not biting, with the faintest breeze coming down from the ridge. The field behind the cabin sloped gently upward, giving you a wide stretch of open sky. We all lay there on our backs, and I pointing out satellites and the occasional streak of a meteor. It started when I noticed a cluster of stars near Cassiopeia that looked a little off, not brighter or dimmer, just positioned strangely, like one had slipped slightly out of place. I blinked a few times. The stars around it stayed fixed, the constellations perfectly normal, but that one star was drifting, slowly, almost imperceptibly, sliding sideways along a path that didn't match anything I knew. Not a satellite arc, not a plane, not a shooting star. It looked like a star being nudged on a track. I propped myself onto my elbows, trying to follow its movement. The The longer I watched, the more certain I was. This thing was moving. Maybe an inch at a time if you held up a hand to measure. "Hey," I said quietly, not wanting to sound weird, "does that star look like it's moving to you?" Jonah didn't answer at first. He was half asleep on his blanket. Ariana turned her head and squinted up at the sky. "Which one?" I pointed directly at it. The star froze. It stopped so abruptly I thought my eyes had tricked me. It sat perfectly still, indistinguishable from every other point of light. The moment Ariana followed my finger, there was no movement. Nothing strange, just a normal sky. I let my hand fall. "Never mind. I think I'm just tired." Ariana shrugged and lay back down. Jonah mumbled something about grabbing another beer and wandered inside. I stayed upright, watching that same patch of sky. And after about 10 seconds, the star started moving again. A fraction at a time. A patient, deliberate glide, like it wasn't trying to hide so much as avoid being seen in motion. My mouth went dry. I waited another minute to be sure, then called out again, "Ariana, look, now it's moving." She sat up with a sigh. "Which one? You gotta show me." I pointed. And again, instant stillness. No drifting, no sliding, no movement at all. A strange pressure settled into my chest, something like embarrassment mixed with a creeping sense that the timing wasn't a coincidence. The moment someone else looked, it stopped. I tried a third time. I waited until Jonah came back out with beers, gave it another 15 seconds until the star was unmistakably drifting again, then said, "You guys gotta see this. That one's shifting." Both of them looked up. I pointed. "Frozen." Jonah stared for a second, shrugged, and handed me a beer. "Man, you're just tired. Stars don't move sideways." I forced a laugh, but couldn't stop watching. When they went back to their conversation, the drifting resumed. Only this time, the star shifted downward, a subtle diagonal slide. Not fast, just steady. Like something testing boundaries. Ariana eventually headed inside to make tea, and Jonah went with her, leaving me alone in the field. I lay back down and fixed my eyes on the drifting star. I didn't blink for long stretches because every time I did, I feared I'd miss something. The movement grew slightly more noticeable. Still subtle, but steady enough that if I focused on another star beside it, I could track the difference. The drifting star crossed a gap between two faint stars and kept going. The space behind it didn't change. No afterglow, no streak, no trail. Just quiet, patient movement. I whispered, "What are you doing?" I hadn't meant to say anything out loud. The words slipped out because the silence was thick and the night felt like it was waiting for something from me. The star dimmed. Not by much, just a small pulse like a dying flashlight bulb. Then it brightened again, gradually returning to its normal intensity. I sat up. "Okay," I murmured. "That's not normal." And then, this part is what stuck with me more than the movement. The drifting star paused for the first time without me pointing at it. It hung there, faintly brighter than before. A prickling sensation spread across my arms. I felt exposed out there in the open, even though logically nothing around me had changed. The breeze had stopped. The cold felt sharper. And then the star resumed drifting, but now in a direction that made even less sense. Upward, against the natural arc of the sky, not rising like the rest of the stars, just climbing. A tiny climb, a careful shift. I stood up. When I broke eye contact for just 1 second, just long enough to brush dirt from my jeans, the star brightened again. A flash, brief but sharp. I froze. My heart felt lodged up in my throat. "Jonah!" I shouted. He slid open the back door and squinted at me. "What?" "Just come out here, please." He sighed but stepped onto the porch. "What now?" I pointed at the sky without speaking. The star locked into place instantly. Jonah stared. "Which one am I?" And before he finished the sentence, the star went dimmer, just slightly, like a fading bulb. He frowned. "That one? It's just twinkling." "No," I said, "it's been moving, sliding." "Stars don't slide," he said gently. I lowered my hand and stared again. The star remained perfectly still, but I felt watched, not stared at emotionally, more like someone calculating distance, measuring, waiting. Jonah gave me a weird look, but eventually went back inside, murmuring something about me needing sleep. I stayed alone in the field. When I looked back up, the star didn't drift right away. It waited. 10 seconds. 15. 20. Then it slid again, but this time much faster. Not fast enough to streak, but fast enough that I muttered, "Holy shit," under my breath when I saw it cross a visible distance. It moved toward another cluster of stars, then stopped dead. Then the sky brightened, not a flash, not a beam, just a brief thinning of the darkness in a small circle around that point. And everything in me screamed that something was about to happen. I stepped backward, my boots crunching in the dry grass. The drifting star pulsed faintly a third time. Then it faded. Not out of sight, out of existence, like something had turned off a light behind a tiny pinhole. The sky where it had been looked too empty, like there should have been a star there, but there wasn't. I waited for it to reappear. It didn't. 10 seconds. Nothing. 30. Nothing. A full minute. Nothing. When I finally tore my eyes away, I walked backward all the way to the cabin, unable to shake the feeling that if I looked up again too quickly, I would see the star above me instead of where it had been. Inside, I tried to explain it to Jonah and Ariana. Neither of them had seen anything unusual. They brushed it off as eye strain. Maybe one of those floaters you get when you stare too long at something bright. I didn't argue. It wouldn't have mattered. When we all went to bed, I lay awake for hours, staring out the small window near the bunk beds. Most of the stars looked normal, but every now and then when my eyes drifted away from a particular spot, I thought I saw a faint glimmer of movement in the corner of my vision, like something shifting just out of sight. And each time I looked straight at it, it stopped. The fog was thick enough that my headlights felt useless. It wasn't the drifting kind that moves like smoke. It was the heavy, static kind that sits in place and swallows everything outside the windshield. I was driving back from my friend Marcy's place in Pacific Grove, taking the coastal highway later than I should have. It was close to 1 a.m., and the air was cold enough that my breath fogged the cabin every time I exhaled too hard. I'd driven this stretch of road hundreds of times, curves, cliffs, guardrails, all muscle memory. But that night, the fog made everything feel unfamiliar. Shapes appeared out of nowhere and vanished before I reached them. The white lines seemed to float instead of sit on asphalt. Even the sound of the engine felt muffled. About 10 miles south of town, the fog shifted. Not cleared. Shifted. The density dipped for a moment, like something passed through it or stirred it from inside. I slowed to around 30 miles per hour and leaned forward over the wheel. Through the haze, maybe 100 feet ahead, I saw a shadow. At first, I thought it was a tree limb hanging low across the road, or some construction equipment accidentally left behind. But the shape didn't match anything solid I recognized. It hung above the road, maybe 15 feet up, just a dark mass suspended in the fog, perfectly still. I eased off the gas. The road was empty in both directions. No lights, no houses, just 2 lanes of asphalt carved along the coastline with cliffs on one side and forest on the other. The shape didn't move. The closer I got, the darker it looked. Not black, exactly. More like an absence of light. Like the fog itself was bending around it. It didn't reflect my headlights. It didn't cast a shadow. It just hovered, blocking the faint gray glow of the sky above. My first instinct was to stop, but something about the stillness of it made stopping feel worse. So I kept rolling forward, barely creeping now, tires crunching softly on the uneven pavement. My heart was beating way too hard for how slow the truck was moving. Every breath felt shallow. I remember gripping the wheel tighter without realizing it. When I reached the exact spot where the shape had been hovering, the fog cleared. Instantly. Not gradually. Not thinning. It was like someone flipped a switch. 1 second I was driving through dense white haze, and the next the air around me was perfectly clear. I could see the trees, the cliff edge, the sky. Stars even, faint ones, but visible. And the shape was gone. There was no sign anything had ever been there. No branches, no debris, nothing disturbed on the road. I slowed to a stop anyway and rolled down the window. The air was completely still. No wind, no surf noise from below, even though I knew the cliffs dropped to the ocean on the west side. Everything felt paused. Then, behind me, the fog closed again. I watched it through the rearview mirror, like a wall pulling itself back together. Dense, pale, completely opaque. I looked forward. Clear. I stepped on the gas again, moving slowly, unable to shake the feeling I was being funneled through some corridor created by whatever I just passed. My hands were shaking now. Not violently, but enough that I noticed. For about a mile, the road stayed clear ahead and sealed behind. The fog wall followed at a distance, but no matter how fast or slow I went, it stayed the same space behind me. It didn't catch up. It didn't fall away, it just followed. I kept glancing at it in the mirror, checking to see if anything moved inside it. I thought I saw faint shifting once, like a darker patch drifting across the pale density, but every time I blinked, it disappeared. About 5 minutes later, the fog started thinning ahead again, this time gently. The road looked normal, trees on the left, cliffs on the right, nothing strange. Then the dashboard lights flickered, just a single pulse, dim, bright, dim. The engine didn't stutter, but the radio crackled, even though it had been off. My phone, plugged into the charger, vibrated once without receiving any notification. I didn't like the timing of any of that. When I looked back at the mirror again, the fog wall was gone. Completely gone. The air behind me was empty and clear, and I hadn't seen or heard it dissipate. I drove faster than I meant to for the next several miles, mostly out of instinct. Every few seconds, I checked the sky in case another shadow was hanging above the road. But the sky stayed normal. Too normal. I calmed down a little by the time I reached the turnout near Garrapatta, the one with the small wooden fence. I pulled over, mostly to breathe and tell myself I'd imagined the shape. Fog can do weird things, especially coastal fog. I'd seen it bend headlights before, distort silhouettes. Maybe I was exhausted. Maybe it was one of those illusions where the fog density makes it look like something is floating. I got out and stood on the gravel. My breath blew sideways as a light breeze finally picked up. The ocean roared down below, steady and familiar. The night smelled like kelp and cold salt. Nothing strange. I turned off the truck and leaned against the hood, scanning the sky. Clear. Then I noticed something subtle. The fog line out to the south looked too straight. Instead of drifting like normal fog banks, the edge was perfectly even, like a sheet of fabric stretched across the coastline. A long, smooth boundary with no swirling, no soft edges, and it was moving. Slowly. Crawling north. Not rolling like fog does. Sliding. I froze and watched it approach. The line crept up the coastline, not rising or falling with the terrain, just gliding. Then it stopped. Perfectly. Maybe a quarter mile away, like it had reached some invisible boundary. My pulse hammered again. I got back in the truck, hands trembling a little as I turned the ignition. The dashboard lights dimmed again, not flickering this time, just dipping low and rising back to normal. As I pulled back onto the road, I kept an eye on the fog line. It stayed still, unmoving as I passed. But when I curved around the next bend, I saw a darker patch inside it. Just for a second, like something large had shifted within the fog's thickness. I didn't slow down to check. The rest of the drive home was uneventful, but the quiet felt heavy. I kept expecting the fog to reappear in my rearview mirror or a shadow to appear above the road again. But nothing happened. When I got home around 1:40 a.m., I sat in the driveway for a while with the engine running, headlights pointed at my garage. I watched the mirrors, making sure the fog hadn't followed me inland. The air in town was completely clear. Cold, still, ordinary. Inside, everything felt normal too. Heater humming, fridge cycling, the usual faint street noise. But when I lay down in bed later, staring at the ceiling, I kept replaying the moment the fog had cleared in an instant, right under that hovering shape. The sudden open air, the vanishing, the way the fog behind me had sealed like a door closing. And for a brief moment before I fell asleep, I thought I felt the same pressure in the air. The strange stillness I'd felt on the road. By morning, it was gone. But sometimes when I drive that same stretch of highway at night, I still check the fog for shapes hanging above it, just to make sure the road is empty. I woke up because the room felt wrong. Not cold, not loud, just wrong, like I'd been dreaming with my eyes open. The first thing I noticed was my phone lying on my chest, screen glowing faintly. I never fall asleep with it in bed. I usually plug it in across the room so I don't doom scroll half the night, but there it was, warm against my shirt like it had been on for a while. When I picked it up, the camera app was open, front-facing. I blinked a few times, trying to piece together if I'd accidentally grabbed it in my sleep, but the position didn't make sense. It wasn't under my hand or near the pillow. It was centered on my chest like someone had set it there. I hit the gallery button. Gallery button. There was a new photo from 3:17 a.m. It wasn't of me or the bed. It was angled upward, toward the ceiling in the far corner of my room. The image wasn't bright, but in the corner near the molding was a small, hazy glow. Not a reflection or light leak, just a faint, round patch of pale white, maybe the size of a tennis ball. I stared at it, waiting for something in the image to click. Maybe a car passing outside had cast light through the blinds. Maybe my clock display had reflected off something, but nothing matched the angle. The glow floated in empty air. I lowered the phone and looked at the ceiling. Nothing. Just the usual shadows cast by the streetlight through the blinds. I checked the time, 3:24 a.m. Only 7 minutes had passed since the photo was taken. I sat up slowly, listening to the quiet. My house in Rio Vista was usually alive with small sounds, AC humming, the fridge clicking, pipes settling, but that night everything felt muted, like the walls were thicker. I took another look at the photo, zooming in until the pixels blurred. The glow didn't have edges. It didn't brighten anything around it. It was almost like fog, but fog doesn't hang in perfect round patches indoors. I turned the camera to the same corner and aimed the phone. Nothing showed, just the beige ceiling and a darker patch where the walls met. I got out of bed, my legs prickling with that half-asleep numbness, and walked to the corner. I reached up and touched the ceiling. Cool, solid, normal. No drafts, no warmth, no discoloration. When I stepped back, the floor creaked under me, an ordinary sound, but in that silence, it felt too loud. I checked the rest of the house. The hall was dark. The bathroom door was half open the way I'd left it. The kitchen light I usually kept on as a nightlight was flickering very slightly, like the bulb was struggling. I flipped the switch off, then on again. The flicker stopped, but the quiet didn't. Back in the bedroom, I sat at the edge of the bed and tried to remember my dream, if I'd even been dreaming before waking up. All I could recall was a pressure on my chest, something heavy or warm. I'd chalked it up to my blanket bunching up, but the more I thought about it, the more it didn't line up. I went into my phone settings to check the battery usage. Sure enough, the camera app had been running for 7 minutes. The photo was taken at the beginning of that. Something had woken the phone, unlocked it, opened the camera, and taken a picture. The unlock logs showed it had recognized my face, except my face wasn't in the frame. I tried to laugh at myself, but it came out shaky. I put the phone screen down on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. When I lay back down, the room felt heavier than before. I tried breathing through it, telling myself it was nothing, just a glitch. Maybe my face had partially triggered the sensor somehow. I almost fell asleep again when something in the hallway made a soft tapping sound. Not a footstep, not a pipe, more like a fingertip brushing the wall. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then another tap, slightly closer, like it was near the doorframe now. I reached over and grabbed the phone, turning on the screen. The sudden light felt blinding. My finger hovered over the flashlight icon, but I didn't tap it yet. I strained to hear anything in the hallway, but the silence after those taps was so complete it felt intentional. I slid quietly out of bed and walked to the door. The floorboards groaned under me. When I pulled the door open, the hallway looked ordinary. Dim light from the street lamp slipping through the living room blinds, everything still. I flicked on the hall light. The brightness didn't reveal anything, but it made something else obvious. The air in that hallway felt ever so slightly warmer, like someone had been standing there not long before. I checked every room, living room, kitchen, bathroom, pantry, nothing. But the longer I stood there, the more a faint ringing started building in my ears, like the hum of electronics, except I couldn't find the source. I went back to the bedroom. The ringing faded when I stepped inside, replaced by that thick quiet again. I grabbed the phone from the nightstand. The camera app was open again. I hadn't touched it. The lens was facing outward, like someone had been holding the phone and lowering it just before I picked it up. The screen showed black, my hand covering it when I grabbed the phone, but the open app wasn't from muscle memory. I knew I hadn't opened it. My thumb trembled a little as I backed out of the camera and returned to the gallery. A second new photo had appeared, taken at 3:31 a.m. The angle was different from the first. This one was angled slightly downward toward my bed. It showed the mattress, the blanket, the shadow of my head on the pillow, taken from maybe 5 or 6 feet away, like someone had stood at the foot of the bed holding the phone. I hadn't been out of bed at 3:31, and my phone had been on the nightstand. There was nothing unusual in the photo except for one thing. The same faint glow from the first image was visible again, this time near the right side of the frame, as if it had drifted across the room. I dropped the phone onto the blanket and backed up until I hit the wall. My breathing sounded too loud. The rest of the room was silent. My first instinct was to leave. Just grab my keys, walk outside, sit in the truck until sunrise. But stepping into that hallway again felt like stepping into a space where something had already been. Instead, I switched on every light in the room, all 3 lamps and the overhead. The shadows dissolved, but the tension didn't. I picked the phone back up, forcing myself to zoom in on the second photo. The glow looked more defined. Not a shape exactly, just a sharper boundary. I could almost make out a gradient, like it had depth. I backed out of the photo and checked the camera again. I didn't take another picture, but I pointed the lens at the same corner where the glow had appeared. Nothing. Then the phone vibrated in my hand. No notification, no call, just a single buzz like the kind you get when a device recognizes your face. Except the screen was already on, already active, and I wasn't holding it in front of me. I lowered the phone slowly. The buzzing stopped. I stood there for a long time, too afraid to turn off the lights, too afraid to lie back down. Sometime near dawn, the exhaustion finally hit hard enough that I sat at the foot of the bed with my back to the wall, phone in hand, eyes half open. No new photos appeared. No hum returned. No tapping. When the sun came through the blinds, the house felt normal again. The fridge clicked on. A neighbor's car started outside. The birds were loud. I checked the photos in daylight to make sure I hadn't imagined anything. Both were still there. Both showed the glow. I deleted them, not because I thought it would help, but because I didn't want to look at them anymore. But sometimes late at night, when the house is too quiet, I wake up and check my phone right away without even thinking, just to make sure the camera isn't open and that there aren't any new photos I don't remember taking. The email came in at 6:42 in the morning, right when the fog was starting to lift off the water. I was already awake because the ferry horn had gone off twice, low and long, the way it did when visibility was bad. I lived alone in a small rental on the Washington coast, just north of Aberdeen, close enough to the inlet that everything smelled like salt and wet wood. I'd posted the photos the night before, half expecting nothing to come of it. The subject line said, Records Inquiry, reference 11B. The email itself was short, polite, no logos. It said my name, spelled correctly, said they were with a regional records office and had some follow-up questions regarding images I'd recently shared online. It asked if I was available later that day to speak in person, no phone number. Just a line that said someone could stop by if that was convenient. I hadn't given my address anywhere. The photos were of something I'd seen out by the jetty the previous evening. I'd been walking my dog, Theo, just before sunset. The weather was calm, cloudy, that flat gray light you get before everything turns dark. Out over the water, maybe a few hundred yards out, there'd been something sitting just above the surface. Not moving, not blinking. Just a dull, metallic-looking shape, like a stretched oval, catching light wrong. I'd taken maybe 6 photos on my old Canon. Nothing fancy. By the time I lowered the camera and looked again, it wasn't there. No splash, no wake, just water. The photos weren't clear. I said that in the post. People argued about boats, buoys, reflections. A few people said drone. I stopped replying and went to bed. So when I got the email, my first thought was scam. My second thought was that maybe I'd messed up by posting at all. I didn't reply. At 11:10 a.m., someone knocked on my door. Theo barked once, then went quiet, tail low. That wasn't normal for him. I see the porch clearly when I open the door. There's no place to hide, no long walkway, just 3 steps and gravel beyond that. There was a man standing there holding a slim folder under one arm. He looked late 40s, maybe early 50s. Tall, but not in a noticeable way. Brown jacket, buttoned, even though it wasn't cold, gray slacks, clean shoes. He smiled like someone who practiced smiling in mirrors. Mr. Calder, he said. Thank you for your time. I asked who he was. Evan Holt, he said. I sent you an email this morning. Records office. He said it like that explained everything. I asked how he got my address. He said publicly available sources. That should have been my cue to close the door. Instead, I stepped aside. He didn't look around when he came in, didn't comment on the dog or the smell of coffee or anything. He stood where I indicated and waited. He asked about the photos. I told him what I'd seen, same as I'd written. Shape over the water. Still. Gone. He nodded at specific points, asked what direction I'd been facing, asked what time the ferry passed, asked whether the tide had been coming in or going out. I didn't remember mentioning the tide anywhere. He asked what kind of camera I used. When I told him, he nodded again like he already knew. Then he asked where the original memory card was. Still in the camera, I said. I uploaded straight from it. Excellent, he said. We'd like to take a look at that. I asked if he meant the photos. The card, he said. If you don't mind. I hesitated, asked why. He said, sometimes compression alters context. That didn't make sense, but he said it smoothly, like a line he'd used before. I went and got the camera, took out the SD card. It felt stupidly small sitting in my palm. He didn't touch it right away. Asked me to confirm that it hadn't been altered, that I hadn't copied it elsewhere, that I hadn't lent the camera to anyone. Then he took the card, slid it into a small envelope, and sealed it. How long will you need it? I asked. Not long, he said. We'll return it today. I asked him if this had anything to do with the ferry traffic or the Coast Guard. He smiled again. No, sir. Before he left, he paused at the door. You didn't see lights, he said. Not a question. No, I said. Just the shape. He nodded, satisfied, and stepped out into the fog. I watched him walk down the gravel, past my truck, and toward the road. I didn't hear a car start. I waited, listening, but there was nothing. When I stepped outside, the road was empty. At 4:30 that afternoon, there was another knock. Same man, same clothes, same folder. He handed me the envelope. Thank you for your cooperation, he said. I asked if he'd found anything. He said nothing outside expected parameters. I opened the envelope after he left. The card was inside. That night, I put it into my computer. It was blank, no photos, no file structure, like it had never been used. I checked the camera, same thing, no images. The camera's internal counter showed 0 shots taken. The next morning, I emailed him, asked what happened. He replied an hour later. The card was returned in its original condition. The message said, no data was present upon receipt. I walked back down to the jetty that evening. The water was rougher, windier, normal. Out over the same stretch, the ferry horn sounded once, long and low, even though visibility was clear. I didn't take my camera with me. I noticed the first porch light go out when I was halfway up Alder Street. It was a chilly March night, clear enough that you could see the thin clouds drifting over the neighborhood, but cold enough that I had my hands shoved into the pockets of my hoodie. I'd stayed late at my friend Mason's place watching some documentary he wanted me to see, and by the time I started heading home, it was close to 1 a.m. The streets in our neighborhood were always dead at that hour. Just rows of single-story houses, parked cars, and the occasional cat slipping between yards. The lights along Alder weren't fancy, just those small yellow porch bulbs people leave on so their front steps aren't pitch black. The first one, the house with the trimmed hedges and the busted mailbox, flickered once. I thought maybe the bulb was dying. Then it clicked off completely. I kept walking, not thinking much of it, until the next house's porch light flickered too. Then it went out. One house down, same thing. A flutter of dim yellow, then darkness. At first, I honestly thought it was some kind of neighborhood power dip, but if that were the case, the streetlights should have gone out too. They didn't. They stayed solid and steady, humming the way they always did. Only the porch lights, one after another, switched off as I approached. I slowed down without meaning to. The sound of my footsteps on the sidewalk suddenly felt loud, like the night had thickened around me. I looked behind me, checking if maybe some raccoon or stray dog was triggering motion sensors or something stupid like that, but the houses behind me stayed dark. Nothing was moving. When I turned forward again, the next light in line, 2 houses ahead, blinked and died. I stopped completely. I don't know how long I stood there, listening. The neighborhood was usually quiet, but this was a different kind of quiet. Not peaceful. Just empty. I stepped forward again, more slowly this time, watching the row of houses. As I moved, the lights kept going out exactly in sync with my pace, like I was tripping some invisible switch. But they were too far away for motion sensors, and I wasn't close enough to trigger anything. That was when something shifted overhead. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like the air above me thickened for a second. I looked up and saw the clouds sliding past the moon. Nothing unusual at first, just thin gray streaks moving like they always did. Then a darker shape drifted across them. No outline, no steady form, just a faint shadow that didn't match the cloud layer. It moved too smoothly, too deliberately. I stood there with my mouth slightly open, watching it glide from one side of the street to the other. It didn't resemble a plane or helicopter. It didn't blink or glow. It was just darker, a smudge against the sky, with no sound at all. Then it paused. Not visibly, just its movement stopped. The clouds kept drifting, but the shadow held perfectly still. That was enough for me to start walking again, this time a little faster. I didn't want to run yet, because running felt like it would make everything worse somehow, but I needed to get home. As I passed the house with the big elm tree, its porch light flickered violently for a full second before going out. Not a glitch. Not a power issue. It felt timed. Another light blinked off, then another. They were dropping ahead of me like dominoes. I pulled out my phone to text Mason, but the screen didn't wake up. It stayed black. No matter how many times I tapped, swiped, or pressed the buttons, it didn't respond. The battery wasn't dead. I'd charged it before leaving. It was like the whole phone had just stopped being a phone. My chest tightened as I kept walking. I glanced up again, and the shadow in the clouds moved. Not across the sky this time, downward. Just a few feet, barely noticeable, but enough that it made my breath catch. It wasn't lowering fast like something falling. It was controlled, intentional. My heart started pounding so hard I heard it in my ears. I cut across the street to Pine Avenue, trying to break the weird pattern with the porch lights, but the first house I passed there flickered out too. Same slow blink, same soft click, same darkness afterward. I swear I could feel something overhead, some weight or pressure in the air. The kind of feeling you get when you know someone is looking at you, even if you can't see them. I walked faster. Not quite running, but close. Halfway down Pine, the last street light on the block dimmed. Not fully off, just lowered as if someone had a dial. The dimming spread to the next light, then the next, rolling ahead of me like a wave stretching down the street. The sky went a shade darker. Not from clouds. The clouds actually thinned out enough for me to see more stars. The darkness felt more like something above me was blocking what little light the moon gave off. I finally broke into a jog. The house at the corner of Pine and Willow was mine. Brown siding, lopsided fence, motion light that never worked right. I could see it from halfway up the block, the faint glow of my living room TV flickering inside because I'd left it on for background noise. But the moment I stepped within a certain distance, maybe 30 feet, the porch bulb made a tiny buzzing sound and shut off. The whole front of my house went dark. That was the moment panic finally hit me. I sprinted the last stretch, almost tripping over the uneven concrete near my driveway. I didn't look up again. I didn't need to. The air pressed down on me like a heavy blanket, thick enough that it made my ears feel clogged. I reached the door, grabbed the handle, and nearly dropped my keys trying to unlock it. My hands were shaking hard enough that I had to steady them against the siding. When the door finally swung open, warm air spilled out. I stepped inside and slammed it behind me, locking both deadbolts even though I'd never used the second one before. The instant the door clicked shut, the TV audio faded back in, the refrigerator hum returned, and something outside made a soft popping sound, like a far-off spark. I stood there in the entryway, breathing hard, listening. The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was normal, familiar. After a minute, I forced myself to peek out the small window near the door. All the porch lights on the street were on again. Every single one. No flickering. No delay, just steady yellow glows like nothing had happened. I stayed awake for hours, watching the windows, listening for anything unusual. Nothing happened. The neighborhood went back to being exactly what it always was. A quiet little grid of streets with identical houses and predictable nights. But every time I step outside after dark now, I catch myself looking up at the clouds, checking for anything moving the wrong way. Anything too smooth or too quiet. Anything that pauses when I pause. And sometimes, when I walk home late, I swear I still see the porch lights hesitate, before staying lit, just long enough to make me wonder if something is still up there, drifting above the neighborhood, waiting for the right moment to glide across the sky again.